In the depths of winter, when darkness claims the northern lands for months on end, something extraordinary once stirred beneath the ice and snow. From forests that stretched beyond memory, from lakes that mirrored ancient skies, a people emerged, who would shake the very foundations of Europe. Their footsteps would echo across battlefields from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Their banners would wave over territories that spanned 3 continents, and their kings would be remembered as lions. Of the North, this is the story of how a remote kingdom of farmers and warriors became the master of half the known world. How Sweden rose from the shadows of medieval obscurity to cast its own shadow across the age of empires. Listen now, as the wind carries their tale across the centuries. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts just like yours. Long before the world knew the thunder of Swedish cannons or the sight of blue and yellow banners streaming across foreign battlefields, the land that would become Sweden existed in a realm of myth and mystery. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote of the distant Suiones, a people who lived beyond the reach of imperial eagles, masters of ships and the northern seas. These early inhabitants of Scandinavia dwelt in a world where the boundary between legend and reality was as thin as morning mist over a forest lake. The Sweden of the early medieval period was not yet a unified kingdom, but a collection of tribal territories, each ruled by local chieftains who held sway over their particular valleys, forests, and shorelines. The sphere, from whom the nation would eventually take its name, controlled the central regions around what would become Stockholm, while the Geta dominated the southern lands. These were not the sophisticated political entities of later centuries, but rather communities bound together by kinship, shared traditions, and the ancient laws spoken aloud at sacred groves and stone circles. In those distant times, the Swedish landscape was even more dominated by wilderness than it is today. Vast forests of pine and spruce stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles, broken only by the gleaming surfaces of countless lakes and the silver threads of rivers that flowed toward the Baltic Sea. It was a land where wolves howled in the depths, of winter nights, where the aurora borealis painted the sky in ethereal colors, and where the old gods still held sway in the hearts of the people. The Swedish tribes of this era were formidable warriors, skilled in the arts of war that had been passed down through generations. They fought with iron swords and axes, protected themselves with wooden shields painted in clan colors, and wore their hair long in the manner of their ancestors. But they were also skilled craftsmen, creating intricate metalwork that would be buried with their dead, and traders who ventured far beyond their homeland in search of silver, silk, and exotic goods from distant lands. The ancient Swedish religion centered around the worship of Norse gods, whose deeds were recounted in epic poems and sagas. Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war, was particularly revered, as was Thor, the thunder god whose hammer protected both gods and mortals from the forces of chaos. The great temple at Uppsala, with its golden hall and sacred groves, served as the spiritual center of this pagan world, where kings and common folk alike came to seek the favor of the gods. Trade routes established by these early Swedes extended far beyond their homeland, reaching along the rivers of Russia to the Byzantine Empire and even to the distant markets of Constantinople. Swedish merchants and warriors, known to the outside world as Varangians, served as guards to Byzantine emperors and founded the first Russian state at Novgorod. These early connections to the wider world would prove crucial in the development of Swedish power and influence. The conversion to Christianity came gradually to Sweden, beginning in the 11th century, but not completed until well into the 12th. This religious transformation would fundamentally alter Swedish society, bringing with it new forms of governance, law, and social organization. The old pagan traditions did not disappear overnight, but rather blended with Christian beliefs, creating a unique cultural synthesis that would characterize Swedish civilization for centuries to come. As the medieval period progressed, the various Swedish tribes began to coalesce under increasingly powerful kings. The process was neither smooth nor peaceful, involving countless battles, alliances, and betrayals as ambitious rulers sought to extend their domains. The legendary Eric the Lawgiver, who may have ruled in the 12th century, is remembered as one of the first to attempt to create a unified legal system for all Swedish territories. The establishment of Christianity also brought Sweden into closer contact with the rest of medieval Europe. Swedish kings began to marry into foreign royal families. Swedish nobles sent their sons to study in Paris and other centers of learning, and Swedish merchants established trading posts in cities across northern Europe. This growing integration with the wider world would prove to be a double-edged sword, bringing both opportunities and challenges that would shape the future of the Swedish kingdom. The year 1397 marked a turning point in Scandinavian history, though few could have predicted the profound consequences that would flow from the coronation ceremony held in the ancient Danish city of Kalmar. There, in the shadow of the great castle that overlooked the Baltic Sea, a remarkable woman named Margaret of Denmark orchestrated what would become known as the Kalmar Union, a political arrangement that brought together the three kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single crown. Margaret herself was a figure of extraordinary political skill and determination. Born into the Danish royal family, she had married the Norwegian king Håkon VI and had spent years maneuvering through the complex web of Scandinavian politics. When both her husband and her young son died, leaving her in a precarious position, she demonstrated a mastery of statecraft that would make her one of the most powerful rulers of her age. Rather than accepting the traditional fate of royal widows, she seized control of the Danish throne and began to weave together the threads of a grand political design. The creation of the Kalmar Union was born from both practical necessity and visionary ambition. The constant warfare between the Scandinavian kingdoms had exhausted their treasuries and devastated their peoples. Trade routes were disrupted, fields lay fallow, and the threat of foreign invasion loomed over the fragmented region. Margaret recognized that unity offered the only path to security and prosperity, and she pursued this goal with relentless determination. The Swedish nobility, weary of endless conflicts and attracted by the promise of stability and expanded trade, opportunities initially supported the union. They saw in Margaret a ruler who respected their traditional privileges while offering protection from external threats. The young Eric of Pomerania, Margaret's chosen heir, was crowned as king of all three kingdoms in a ceremony that was intended to herald a new age of Scandinavian cooperation and shared destiny. For several decades, the Kalmar Union functioned as Margaret had envisioned. Trade flourished, as merchants could now move freely between the three kingdoms without the burden of customs duties and political barriers. The combined naval forces of the Union dominated the Baltic Sea, protecting merchant vessels from pirates and ensuring the safe passage of goods between the various ports. Cultural exchange increased as nobles, clergy, and scholars moved between the courts of Copenhagen, Oslo, and Stockholm. However, the Union also contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The Swedish nobility, proud of their ancient traditions and jealous of their independence, began to chafe under what they perceived as Danish domination. Key positions in the Swedish administration were increasingly filled by Danes and Swedish. Resources were often directed toward Danish interests rather than those of Sweden itself. The delicate balance that Margaret had maintained through her personal charisma and political skill began to unravel after her death. The reign of Eric of Pomerania proved to be particularly problematic for Swedish-Danish relations. Unlike Margaret, who had governed with a light touch and respect for local customs, Eric attempted to centralize authority and impose uniformity across the three kingdoms. His expensive wars with the Hanseatic League placed a heavy burden on Swedish taxpayers, while his efforts to restrict Swedish trade autonomy generated growing resentment among the merchant class. The situation came to a head in the 1430s, when widespread rebellion erupted across Sweden. The uprising was led by a minor noble named Engelbrektsson, who emerged from the forests of Dalarna to become a symbol of Swedish resistance to Danish rule. Engelbrekts's rebellion was not merely a political uprising, but a manifestation of deeper cultural and economic grievances that had been building for decades. The rebellion of Engelbrekt marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout the 15th century. Swedish nobles and commoners alike would rise up against Danish authority, achieve temporary success, and then watch as their gains were gradually eroded by Danish counterattacks and political maneuvering. This cycle of rebellion and repression created a climate of instability that undermined the original goals of the Kalmar Union. Despite these challenges, the Kalmar Union continued to exist in various forms for more than a century. There were periods of relative peace and cooperation, when it seemed that the original vision of Scandinavian unity might yet be realized. Swedish nobles occasionally found common cause with their Danish counterparts, particularly when faced with external threats or economic opportunities that benefited all three kingdoms. The union also facilitated important cultural and intellectual developments. The late medieval period saw the flowering of Swedish literature, architecture, and religious art, much of it influenced by styles and ideas that flowed freely between the three kingdoms. The great cathedral at Uppsala was rebuilt during this period, incorporating architectural elements from both Danish and German traditions, while Swedish manuscripts began to reflect a more sophisticated understanding of European learning and scholarship, yet the fundamental tensions within the Union could not be permanently resolved. The Swedish desire for independence was too strong, the Danish determination to maintain control too rigid, and the underlying economic and cultural differences too profound. As the 15th century drew to a close, it became increasingly clear that the Kalmar Union, whatever its original merits, was becoming an obstacle to Swedish development rather than a catalyst for it. In the dying years of the 15th century, as the Kalmar Union tottered on the brink of collapse, a new force emerged in Swedish politics that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the kingdom's development. The Stor family, whose members would serve as regents of Sweden for much of the late medieval period, represented a uniquely Swedish approach to governance that combined respect for traditional institutions with a fierce determination to preserve national independence. Sten Sture, the elder, who assumed the regency in 1470, was a man perfectly suited to the turbulent times in which he lived. Unlike many of his contemporaries who looked to foreign courts for models of kingship, Sten Sture understood that Swedish independence could only be maintained through the active support of the Swedish people themselves. He cultivated alliances with farmers, miners, and townspeople, creating a broad-based coalition that could resist Danish pressure even when the nobility wavered in their commitment to independence. The most famous moment of Sten Store's regency came in 1471 at the Battle of Brunkberg, fought on the outskirts of Stockholm. The Danish king, Christian I, had invaded Sweden with a large army. Confident that he could crush Swedish resistance and restore Danish authority once and for all. The battle that followed was more than a military engagement. It was a test of the Swedish people's determination to govern themselves. On the morning of the battle, as mist rose from the Baltic waters and the first light of dawn illuminated the Swedish banners, Sten Sture addressed his troops with words that would echo through Swedish history. He spoke not as a feudal lord commanding his vassals, but as a fellow Swede appealing to shared values and common destiny. The army that faced the Danish invaders was not a collection of mercenaries fighting for pay, but a gathering of men who fought for their homes, their families, and their future as a free people. The victory at Brunkberg was decisive, but its significance went far beyond the immediate military outcome. For the first time in decades, the Swedes had demonstrated that they could stand alone against foreign invasion and emerge victorious. The battle became a symbol of Swedish resilience and independence, inspiring future generations of leaders who would face similar challenges in their quest to build a great Swedish empire. Following his victory, Sten Sture embarked on a program of institutional reform that would lay the groundwork for Sweden's later imperial expansion. He strengthened the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag, ensuring that it became a genuinely representative body that could speak for all classes of Swedish society. He reformed the tax system, making it more equitable and efficient, and he invested heavily in the development of Swedish mining and metallurgy, recognizing that control of Sweden's mineral wealth was essential for maintaining independence. The Sture Regency also marked an important period in Swedish cultural development. The late 15th and early 16th centuries saw the emergence of a distinctly Swedish literary tradition, with chroniclers and poets beginning to celebrate Swedish achievements and values rather than simply imitating foreign models. The University of Uppsala, founded in 1477, became a center of learning that attracted students from across Northern Europe while maintaining its fundamentally Swedish character. When Sten Sture the Elder died in 1503, he was succeeded by a series of regents who continued his policies and maintained Swedish independence despite constant pressure from Denmark. Svante Nilsson, who served as regent from 1504 to 1512, proved to be a skilled diplomat who managed to preserve Swedish autonomy while avoiding the devastating wars that had characterized earlier periods of the Union. The regency of Sten Sture the Younger, who came to power in 1512, marked the final phase of the struggle between Sweden and Denmark for control of the Swedish kingdom. Like his namesake, Sten Sture the Younger was a charismatic leader who understood the importance of popular support in maintaining Swedish independence. He continued the policies of his predecessors while adapting them to meet the changing challenges of the early 16th century. The Danish response to Swedish independence was embodied in the person of Christian II, who became King of Denmark in 1513. Christian II was a ruler of extraordinary ambition and ruthlessness, determined to restore Danish hegemony over all of Scandinavia. Unlike his predecessors, who had often been content with nominal Swedish submission, Christian II sought to eliminate Swedish independence entirely, replacing it with direct Danish administration. The conflict between Sten Sture the Younger and Christian II escalated throughout the 1510s. culminating in a series of wars that would ultimately determine the fate of Scandinavian unity. These conflicts were fought not only on battlefields, but also in the courts of Europe, where both sides sought to gain the support of foreign powers. The Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the emerging powers of Western Europe all had interests in the outcome of the Scandinavian struggle. The death of Sten Sture the Younger in 1520, killed in battle against Danish forces, marked the end of an era in Swedish history. His widow, Christina Gelenstina, courageously attempted to continue the resistance from Stockholm. But the resources and leadership necessary for sustained opposition were no longer available. The fall of Stockholm to Christian II in 1520 appeared to mark the definitive end of Swedish independence and the triumph of Danish authority. Yet even as Christian II celebrated his victory with the notorious Stockholm bloodbath, in which dozens of Swedish nobles were executed in the city's main square, the seeds of Swedish resurgence were already beginning to sprout. In the remote province of Dalarna, where the tradition of independence ran deepest, a young nobleman named Gustav Vasa was beginning to organize a new resistance movement that would not only restore Swedish independence, but lay the foundation for Swedish imperial greatness. The November sky hung heavy and grey over Stockholm in the year 1520, as if the very heavens mourned what was about to unfold in the cobblestone square below. Christian II of Denmark, having finally crushed Swedish resistance and captured the Swedish capital, had proclaimed himself rightful King of Sweden in a ceremony that should have marked the definitive end of Swedish independence. Instead, the events that followed would ignite a fire of rebellion that would burn away the last vestiges of the Kalmar Union and give birth to one of Europe's most formidable empires. The Stockholm bloodbath, as it came to be known, was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated political purge designed to eliminate Swedish resistance once and for all. Christian II had come to understand that previous Danish attempts to control Sweden had failed because they had left the Swedish nobility intact and capable of organizing future rebellions. This time, he was determined to be thorough in his elimination of potential opponents. The execution began in the early hours of November 8, 1520, and continued for 3 days. Among the victims were bishops, nobles, and merchants who had supported Swedish independence, along with their families and associates. The Danish king had obtained a papal dispensation that allowed him to execute even high-ranking church officials, claiming that they were heretics who had opposed the legitimate authority of the church-sanctioned monarch. The list of those executed read like a catalogue of Swedish leadership. Gustav Troll, the Swedish archbishop who had collaborated with the Danes, personally identified many of the victims, settling old scores while serving his foreign masters. The bodies of the executed were burned in a great pyre, and their ashes were scattered to prevent their burial sites from becoming shrines to Swedish independence. Among those marked for death but not yet captured was a young nobleman named Gustav Vasa, whose father had been executed during the bloodbath. Gustav had been in Danish custody but had managed to escape and was now fleeing through the Swedish countryside, seeking refuge wherever he could find it. His flight would take him to the remote province of Dalarna, where the tradition of independence was strongest and where the memory of ancient Swedish freedom still burned bright. In the hearts of the people, the choice of Dalarna as the birthplace of Swedish rebellion was not accidental. This province, with its deep forests, hidden valleys, and fiercely independent inhabitants, had long been a refuge for those who opposed foreign domination. The Dalkarlians, as they were known, were skilled miners and metal workers who had grown wealthy from Sweden's copper and iron deposits. They were also renowned as warriors who had fought in many of Sweden's battles and who maintained their own traditions of self-governance. When Gustav of Vasa arrived in Dalarna in the winter of 1520, he found a people already simmering with rage over the events in Stockholm. The news of the bloodbath had spread quickly through the province, carried by refugees and traders who had witnessed the executions. The Dalkarlians needed little encouragement to take up arms against Christian II, but they did need leadership and coordination if their rebellion was to succeed where previous uprisings had failed. Gustav Vasa's first challenge was to convince the Dalkarlians that he was the right man to lead their rebellion. He was young, only 24 years old, and he had no army, no treasury, and no foreign allies. What he did have was a burning desire for revenge against Christian II and a deep understanding of Swedish character and traditions. He spoke to the Dalkarlians not as a feudal lord demanding obedience, but as a fellow Swede appealing to shared values and common grievances. The famous ski journey that took Gustav Vasa from village to village throughout Dalarna became the stuff of legend. But it was also a masterpiece of political organization. At each stop, he met with local leaders, learned about their specific concerns and grievances, and began to weave together a coalition that could effectively challenge Danish authority. He understood that the rebellion must be more than a noble uprising. It must be a genuine popular movement that could draw support from all levels of Swedish society. The response to Gustav Vasa's appeals was overwhelming. Throughout the winter of 1522-1521, men from across Dalarna began to gather in the forests, bringing with them weapons, supplies, and an unshakable determination to drive the Danish invaders from Swedish soil. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, miners, and craftsmen who had set aside their normal occupations to fight for their freedom. The rebellion that began in Dalarna quickly spread to other parts of Sweden. In province after province, Swedish nobles and commoners alike rose up against Danish authority, inspired by the example of Gustav Vasa and the Dalkarlians. The Danish garrison forces, spread thin across the Swedish countryside, found themselves under attack from multiple directions as the rebellion gained momentum. Gustav Vasa's early military campaigns demonstrated both his tactical skill and his understanding of Swedish conditions. Rather than attempting to meet the Danish armies in pitched battle, where his inferior numbers would have been decisive, he employed guerrilla tactics that took advantage of Sweden's difficult terrain and harsh climate. His forces would strike quickly at isolated Danish outposts, then melt away into the forests before reinforcements could arrive. The rebellion also benefited from the support of the Hanseatic League, the powerful confederation of merchant cities that dominated Baltic trade. The League had its own grievances against Christian II, who had attempted to restrict their trading privileges in Denmark. Lübeck, the leading city of the League, provided Gustav Vasa with crucial military and financial support, including artillery and skilled military advisors. As the rebellion gained strength, Gustav Vasa began to transform himself from a fugitive noble into a national leader. He established a government in exile that claimed to represent the legitimate authority of Sweden, and he began to conduct diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers. His letters to other European courts presented the Swedish rebellion not as a local uprising, but as part of the broader struggle against Danish hegemony in the Baltic region. The turning point came in the spring of 1521, when Gustav Vasa's forces achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Vestas. This triumph not only eliminated a major Danish army, but also opened the way for the rebels to march on Stockholm itself. The Swedish capital, which had been the scene of such tragedy only months before, now beckoned as the prize that would confirm Swedish independence and Gustav Vasa's claim to the throne. The siege of Stockholm in the summer of 1521 was more than a military campaign. It was the culmination of centuries of Swedish dreams and the validation of a people's right to determine their own destiny. As Gustav Vasa's forces surrounded the Danish-held capital, the very stones of the city seemed to whisper the names of those who had died in the bloodbath, their sacrifice now on the verge of achieving its ultimate vindication. The Danish commander of Stockholm, Didrik Slagheck, found himself in an increasingly impossible position. His garrison was outnumbered, his supplies were running low, and the Swedish countryside that should have supported him was instead uniformly hostile. More importantly, the political situation had changed dramatically since Christian II's apparent triumph the previous year. The Danish king himself was facing rebellion in his own domains, and the resources that might have been used to reinforce Stockholm were needed elsewhere. Gustav Vasa approached the siege with the same combination of patience and strategic thinking that had characterized his entire rebellion. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault on the city's formidable walls, he chose to starve the garrison into submission while building his own political and military strength. This approach had the additional advantage of minimizing damage to the city that would soon become the capital of an independent Sweden. The months of siege gave Gustav Vasa the opportunity to consolidate his control over the Swedish countryside and to establish the institutions that would be necessary for effective governance. He convened assemblies of Swedish nobles and commoners, seeking to build consensus for his claim to the throne while addressing the grievances that had made Danish rule so unpopular. These gatherings were remarkable for their inclusiveness, bringing together representatives from all levels of Swedish society in a way that had rarely been seen before. The surrender of Stockholm on June 17, 1523, marked the effective end of the Kalmar Union and the beginning of a new era in Swedish history. As Gustav Vasa rode through the gates of the capital, he was greeted not as a conqueror but as a liberator, welcomed by crowds of citizens who had suffered under Danish occupation. The young man who had fled through the forests of Dalarna as a fugitive now entered Stockholm as the de facto king of an independent Sweden. The formal coronation of Gustav Vasa took place in the great cathedral of Strindens on June 6, 1523, a date that would later be celebrated as Swedish National Day. The ceremony was deliberately designed to emphasize the native Swedish character of the new monarchy, with traditional Swedish customs and symbols taking precedence over foreign influences. The crown that was placed on Gustav Vasa's head was not an ancient relic but a new creation, symbolizing the fresh start that his reign represented. Gustav Vasa's election as king by the Swedish parliament was itself a significant constitutional development. Unlike the hereditary monarchies that dominated most of Europe, the Swedish kingship was presented as a contract between the ruler and the ruled, with specific obligations and limitations on royal power. This arrangement would prove to be one of the foundations of Swedish political development in the centuries that followed. The new king faced enormous challenges in establishing his authority and rebuilding the Swedish state. The wars of liberation had devastated much of the country, leaving fields untilled, trade routes disrupted, and the royal treasury virtually empty. The Danish threat had not disappeared entirely, as Christian II continued to claim the Swedish throne and to seek foreign support for his restoration. Perhaps most importantly, Gustav Vasa had to transform a successful rebellion into a stable government capable of defending Sweden's independence over the long term. One of Gustav Vasa's first and most important decisions was to break with the Catholic Church and establish a Swedish national church under royal control. This Protestant Reformation, which began in the late 1520s, was motivated by both religious and political considerations. The Catholic Church had been closely associated with Danish rule, and many Swedish bishops had collaborated with the occupying forces by establishing religious independence. Gustav Vasa could ensure that no foreign power could use religious authority to undermine Swedish sovereignty. The Swedish Reformation also had crucial economic implications. The vast lands and wealth of the Catholic Church were confiscated by the crown, providing Gustav Vasa with the resources necessary to build a modern state apparatus. These funds were used to strengthen the Swedish military, improve the country's infrastructure, and establish the administrative systems that would be necessary for effective governance of an independent kingdom. Gustav Vasa's domestic policies emphasized the development of Sweden's natural resources and the promotion of native Swedish industry. He invested heavily in mining operations, recognizing that Sweden's copper and iron deposits could provide the foundation for economic independence. He also encouraged the development of Swedish manufacturing, particularly in areas related to military production, understanding that a nation that could arm itself was more likely to remain free. The cultural policies of Gustav Vasa's reign reflected his commitment to Swedish independence in all its forms. He patronized Swedish artists and scholars, encouraged the development of Swedish literature, and promoted the use of the Swedish language in government and education. The translation of the Bible into Swedish, completed in 1541, was not only a religious achievement but also a crucial step in the development of a unified Swedish national identity. Perhaps most importantly, Gustav Vasa began the process of transforming Sweden from a medieval kingdom into a modern European state. He established a professional bureaucracy, reformed the legal system, and created the institutional foundations that would allow Sweden to compete effectively with the other powers of Europe. His reign marked the end of Sweden's medieval period, and the beginning of its emergence as a major European power. As Gustav Vasa consolidated his rule and strengthened the Swedish state, he also began to look beyond Sweden's borders with an eye toward expansion and influence. The Baltic Sea, which had long been dominated by Denmark and the Hanseatic League, beckoned as a natural sphere for Swedish expansion. The weakness of neighboring powers, particularly the decline of the Teutonic Knights and the internal problems of Poland and Russia, offered opportunities for territorial gain that would strengthen Sweden's strategic position. The transformation of Sweden under Gustav Vasa was so complete that by the time of his death in 1560, the country bore little resemblance to the war-torn, occupied territory that he had inherited. He had created a unified, independent, and increasingly powerful kingdom that was poised to play a major role in European affairs. The foundations of the Swedish Empire had been laid, and the stage was set for the remarkable expansion that would follow under his successors. The reign of Gustav Vasa represented more than the establishment of Swedish independence. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in European history. The Sweden that emerged from his reign was not content to remain a remote northern kingdom, but aspired to greatness on the European stage. The young nobles who served in his armies and administration would carry forward his vision of Swedish power and influence, setting the stage for the imperial expansion that would make Sweden one of the dominant forces in 17th century Europe. The first part of this great story draws to a close. We can see in Gustav Vasa's achievement the seeds of everything that would follow. The independent Swedish state that he created would become the launching pad for military campaigns that would reshape the balance of power in Northern and Eastern Europe. The administrative and military reforms that he initiated would evolve into the sophisticated machinery of imperial government that would administer territories from the Baltic to the North Sea. Most importantly, the sense of Swedish national identity and destiny that he fostered would inspire generations of leaders and soldiers who would carry Swedish banners across the battlefields of Europe, building an empire that would endure for more than a century and leave an indelible mark on the history of the continent. The young king's eyes held winter's fire as he gazed across the frost-covered training grounds of Stockholm Castle. Gustav, to Adolf, barely 16 when he assumed the throne, carried within his chest the beating heart of a nation that had tasted power and hungered for more. The year 1611 marked not merely a succession, but a transformation, as if the very soul of Sweden had been reborn in the form of this golden-haired prince who would reshape the map of Europe with sword and strategy. In the early morning mist that clung to the Baltic shores, the sound of marching feet echoed through the cobbled streets of Swedish towns. The king's vision extended far beyond the borders of his inherited realm, reaching toward the German states where religious war had begun to tear the Holy Roman Empire apart. The 30 Years' War, that great conflagration that would consume a generation, beckoned to Sweden like a siren's call, promising glory, territory, and the chance to prove that a northern kingdom could stand among the great powers of Europe. Gustav Adolf understood that Sweden's destiny lay not in the familiar forests of Scandinavia, but in the contested plains of Germany, where Catholic and Protestant forces circled each other like wolves in the darkness. The king's mind, sharp as the steel of his Toledo blade, perceived opportunity where others saw only chaos. The Habsburg dominance over Europe had grown too strong, too suffocating, and the Protestant cause needed a champion who could match the military might of the Catholic League. The transformation of Sweden's military machine began in earnest during these formative years of Gustav Adolf's reign. The young king, tutored by the finest military minds of his time, recognized that traditional medieval warfare would not suffice against the disciplined tercios of Spain or the veteran armies of the Holy Roman Empire. Sweden needed innovation, adaptation, and above all, a new conception of what warfare could become in the modern age. In the armories of Stockholm and the training grounds of Dalarna, a revolution in military thinking took shape under the watchful eye of Sweden's warrior king. Gustav Adolf, blessed with both tactical genius and an understanding of technology's potential, began to forge an army that would become the terror of Europe. The Swedish military machine that emerged from these early years represented nothing less than the birth of modern warfare, a synthesis of discipline, innovation, and adaptability that would echo through the centuries. The king's first innovation lay in the realm of artillery, where other armies dragged massive, unwieldy cannons that required teams of oxen and hours to position. Gustav Adolf commissioned the creation of lighter, more maneuverable field pieces. These leather guns, reinforced with iron bands and mounted on wheels, could be moved rapidly across the battlefield by a handful of men. The psychological impact of artillery that could follow infantry into battle, providing close support rather than distant bombardment, would prove devastating to enemies accustomed to the stately, choreographed nature of traditional siege warfare. But it was in the reorganization of infantry tactics that Gustav Adolf's true genius shone. The traditional Swedish formations, based on deep columns of pike and shot, gave way to thinner, more flexible lines that could respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The king reduced the depth of his formations from 10 ranks to 6, then to 4, allowing for greater firepower and maneuverability. Each regiment became a self-contained unit, capable of independent action while maintaining coordination with the larger army. The Swedish soldier of Gustav Adolf's era differed markedly from his European counterparts. Better paid, better fed, and better trained, these men developed a fierce loyalty to their king and their cause. The traditional mercenary armies of the time, composed of soldiers fighting for coin rather than conviction, could not match the cohesion and morale of forces that believed in their mission. Gustav Adolf understood that an army's strength lay not merely in its weapons or tactics, but in the hearts and minds of the men who wielded those weapons. Winter training in the forests of central Sweden became legendary throughout Europe. While other armies retreated to winter quarters, the Swedish forces continued their drills and maneuvers in conditions that would have broken lesser men. The king himself often participated in these exercises, sharing the hardships of common soldiers, and earning their respect through deed rather than title. This bond between commander and commander would prove crucial in the battles to come, where quick thinking and unwavering trust could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. The Swedish cavalry, traditionally a minor component of Scandinavian armies, underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation under Gustav Adolf's guidance. The king rejected the caracal, the wheeling maneuver favored by other European cavalry forces, in favor of direct shock charges with sabers drawn. These mounted attacks, coordinated with infantry and artillery movements, brought a new dimension to battlefield tactics. The Swedish horse became an instrument of decision, capable of exploiting breakthroughs and pursuing routed enemies with relentless efficiency. As news of these military innovations spread throughout Europe, foreign observers began to take notice of the northern kingdom that had once seemed little more than a backwater principality. Military theorists and seasoned commanders alike marveled at the reports emerging from Sweden, an army that moved with unprecedented speed, struck with devastating force, and displayed a level of discipline that seemed almost superhuman. The stage was being set for Sweden's grand entrance onto the European stage. The first true test of Gustav Adolf's military reforms came not in the German states, but in the familiar yet treacherous landscapes of Poland-Lithuania. The Polish-Swedish wars of the early 1600s served as both proving ground and catalyst for the Swedish military machine, transforming theoretical innovations into battle-tested realities. In the marshy borderlands between Sweden and Poland, among the forests of Livonia and the plains of East Prussia, the future Lion of the North would learn the hard lessons of command and conquest. The conflict with Poland-Lithuania arose from a complex web of dynastic claims, religious tensions, and territorial ambitions that stretched back generations. Gustav, Adolf's father, Karl IX, had pressed Sweden's claims to the Polish crown, setting the stage for a prolonged struggle that would consume the energies of both kingdoms. When the young Swedish king inherited this conflict, he brought to it not merely the determination of his predecessors, but a revolutionary approach to warfare that would transform the nature of the struggle itself. The early campaigns in Livonia revealed both the promise and the challenges of Gustav Adolf's military innovations. The Swedish forces, moving with unprecedented speed and coordination, achieved stunning tactical victories against Polish armies that greatly outnumbered them. The Battle of Walhof in 1626 became a masterpiece of tactical execution, with Swedish cavalry charges, coordinated with artillery and infantry support, routing a Polish force twice their size. The engagement lasted mere hours, but its lessons would echo through the remainder of Gustav Adolf's career. Yet the Polish campaigns also taught the Swedish king the limits of military innovation. The vast distances of Eastern Europe, the harsh climate, and the guerrilla warfare tactics employed by Polish light cavalry presented challenges that could not be solved through superior tactics alone. Gustav Adolf learned to appreciate the importance of logistics, supply lines, and local political alliances, lessons that would prove invaluable in his later German campaigns. The siege of Riga in 1621 demonstrated the Swedish army's growing sophistication in siege warfare. The ancient Hanseatic city, with its strong walls and determined defenders, had withstood numerous attempts at capture. Gustav Adolf's forces, however, employed a combination of traditional siege techniques and innovative engineering that overwhelmed the defenders. The fall of Riga not only secured Swedish control over the Baltic trade routes, but also announced to Europe that Sweden had become a power capable of taking and holding strategic cities. Throughout these Polish campaigns, Gustav Adolf refined his understanding of combined arms tactics. The coordination between infantry, cavalry, and artillery that would later terrorize German battlefields was perfected in the forests and fields of Livonia. Each engagement provided new insights into the potential of flexible, responsive military formations. The Swedish king's ability to adapt his tactics to local conditions, while maintaining the core principles of his military reforms, marked him as a commander of exceptional ability. The Polish Wars also revealed Gustav Adolf's growing skill as a diplomat and strategist. The king understood that military victory alone could not secure lasting gains. He needed to build coalitions, negotiate treaties, and create political structures that would survive his absence. The complex web of alliances and agreements that emerged from the Polish campaigns would serve as a model for Gustav Adolf's later diplomatic efforts in Germany. By 1629, when the Truce of Altmark temporarily ended the Polish-Swedish conflict, Gustav Adolf had achieved his strategic objectives. Sweden retained control of Livonia and its valuable ports, secured significant territorial concessions, and most importantly, gained the practical experience that would prove crucial in the greater conflict to come. The Swedish army that emerged from the Polish campaigns was a far different force than the one that had entered them, hardened by combat, refined by experience, and ready to face the greatest military powers of Europe. The winds of religious war had been gathering over Germany for more than a decade when Gustav Adolf cast his gaze southward from the shores of the Baltic. The 30 Years' War, which had begun as a revolt in Bohemia against Habsburg rule, had metastasized into a continental conflict that threatened to reshape the very foundations of European Christianity. The Catholic League, backed by Spanish gold and imperial authority, had achieved a series of stunning victories that left Protestant Germany reeling and demoralized. In the courts of Stockholm, Hamburg, and The Hague, Protestant ministers and diplomats spoke in hushed tones of the catastrophe that had befallen their cause. The defeat of the Bohemian rebels at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620 had been followed by a series of imperial victories that seemed to herald the triumph of the Counter-Reformation. The Protestant Union, that fragile coalition of German princes and free cities, had dissolved in the face of Catholic military superiority, leaving individual states to face the imperial juggernaut alone. Gustav Adolf watched these developments with the calculating eye of a chess master studying his opponents' moves. The king understood that Sweden's future lay not in the familiar forests of Scandinavia, but in the contested plains of Germany, where the fate of Protestant Europe hung in the balance. The Habsburg dominance over the Holy Roman Empire had grown too strong, too suffocating, and the time had come for a new champion to emerge from the north. The Swedish king's decision to intervene in the German conflict was not made lightly. The financial cost of such an undertaking would strain Sweden's resources to the breaking point. The human cost, measured in the lives of Swedish soldiers far from their homeland, would be even greater. Yet Gustav Adolf possessed a vision that transcended immediate concerns. He saw in the German intervention the opportunity to transform Sweden from a regional power into a great European empire. The diplomatic preparations for Swedish intervention began in earnest during the late 1620s. Gustav Adolf's agents worked tirelessly to build coalitions with Protestant princes, negotiate subsidies from foreign powers, and create the political framework that would support a Swedish military presence. In Germany, the king's correspondence with French ministers, Dutch merchants, and German princes revealed a sophisticated understanding of European balance of power politics that belied his northern origins. France, despite its Catholic faith, emerged as a crucial ally in Gustav Adolf's German plans. Cardinal Richelieu, the brilliant architect of French foreign policy, recognized that Habsburg power posed a greater threat to French interests than Protestant victory in Germany. The subsidies and diplomatic support that flowed from Paris to Stockholm would prove essential to the success of Swedish intervention, creating one of history's most unlikely alliances between Catholic France and Protestant Sweden. The Dutch Republic, engaged in its own life-and-death struggle with Spain, offered both financial support and strategic coordination. The Dutch understanding of naval warfare and commercial politics complemented Swedish military expertise, creating a partnership that would prove devastating to Habsburg interests. The coordination between Swedish land forces and Dutch naval power would repeatedly wrong-foot imperial commanders who had grown accustomed to fighting single-front wars. As 1630 dawned, Gustav Adolf's preparations neared completion. The Swedish army, hardened by years of fighting in Poland and refined by constant innovation, stood ready for its greatest test. The king's diplomatic network had created a web of alliances and agreements that would support Swedish intervention. Most importantly, Gustav Adolf had identified the strategic opportunity that would allow Sweden to enter the German conflict with maximum impact. The plight of the Protestant city of Stralsund, besieged by imperial forces and crying out for salvation the morning of June 24, 1630, dawned grey and misty over the Baltic Sea, the water stretching like hammered pewter toward the German coast. From the decks of Swedish warships, the low-lying shores of Pomerania appeared as a dark line. Against the pale sky, promising adventure and peril in equal measure, Gustav Adolf stood at the prow of his flagship, the golden lions of Sweden snapping in the sea breeze above his head. His eyes fixed on the land that would either make him the master of Northern Europe or consume his kingdom in the flames of war. The Swedish invasion fleet that approached the German coast represented the culmination of years of planning and preparation. Nearly 200 ships of various sizes carried the elite of Swedish military might: 13,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and the most advanced artillery train in Europe. The soldiers packed into the transports were not mere mercenaries fighting for coin, but Swedish patriots convinced of the righteousness of their cause and the genius of their king. The sight of this armada emerging from the northern mists, like something from legend, would haunt the dreams of Catholic commanders, for Years to come, years to come. The landing at Peenemünde proceeded with the precision that had become the hallmark of Swedish military operations. While other armies might have spent weeks establishing a beachhead, Gustav Adolf's forces moved with practiced efficiency. Within hours of the first boats touching shore, Swedish engineers had begun constructing defensive works and landing facilities. The king himself was among the first to set foot on German soil, kneeling briefly to kiss the sand before rising to survey the theatre of his greatest gambit. The psychological impact of the Swedish landing extended far beyond the immediate military significance. For years, Protestant Germany had endured defeat after defeat, watching helplessly as Catholic armies carved up their territories and imposed their will upon ancient liberties. The appearance of a Protestant army of such evident quality and determination sent shockwaves through both camps. In Protestant strongholds from Magdeburg to Augsburg, church bells rang out in celebration of the northern deliverers. In Catholic capitals from Munich to Prague, emergency councils convened to assess this new threat to imperial authority. Gustav Adolf's first challenge in Germany came not from enemy armies, but from the very allies he had come to assist. The Protestant princes of Germany, cowed by years of defeat and suspicious of foreign intervention, proved reluctant to embrace their would-be savior. The Elector of Brandenburg, the Duke of Mecklenburg, and other Protestant leaders watched the Swedish king with a mixture of hope and apprehension, uncertain whether he represented liberation or merely another form of domination. The Swedish king understood that military prowess alone would not secure lasting victory in Germany. He needed to win the hearts and minds of the German people, to present himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a protector of German liberties and Protestant faith. Gustav Adolf's early proclamations to the German people struck this delicate balance, promising to restore ancient freedoms while respecting local customs and laws. The king's fluency in German, his understanding of imperial politics, and his genuine commitment to the Protestant cause gradually won over skeptical allies. The first major test of Swedish resolve came with the siege of Stettin, a strategic port city that controlled access to the Oder River. The imperial garrison, confident in their strong walls and expecting relief from the main Catholic army, initially resisted Swedish demands for surrender. Gustav Adolf's response demonstrated both the effectiveness of his military innovations and his understanding of psychological warfare. The Swedish artillery, lighter and more maneuverable than traditional siege guns, could be rapidly repositioned to exploit weaknesses in the city's defenses. The coordinated bombardment that followed, precise and devastating, convinced the garrison that further resistance was futile. The fall of Stettin opened the door to the German interior and provided Gustav Adolf with the secure base he needed for future operations. More importantly, it demonstrated to friend and foe alike that the Swedish army was not merely another collection of mercenaries, but a professional force capable of achieving rapid, decisive victories. The speed and efficiency of the siege sent tremors through the imperial command structure, forcing a fundamental reassessment of the military balance in northern Germany as summer turned to autumn in 1630. Gustav Adolf's forces consolidated their hold on the Pomeranian coast while extending their influence deeper into German territory. The Swedish king's diplomatic skills proved as valuable as his military talents. As he negotiated agreements with Protestant princes and free cities that provided both strategic bases and local support, the network of alliances that emerged from these early months would prove crucial to Swedish success in the campaigns to come. Count Johann Cercles von Tilly, the aging lion of the Catholic League, had never faced an enemy quite like the Swedish king. For more than 2 decades, this grizzled veteran had terrorized Protestant Germany with his disciplined tercios and ruthless tactics. The man who had crushed the Bohemian rebels at White Mountain and sacked the Protestant stronghold of Magdeburg was accustomed to victory, to the sight of enemy banners trampled in the dust and enemy commanders begging for mercy. Yet as reports of Swedish military innovations reached his headquarters, Tilly began to sense that this northern upstart might prove more challenging than his previous adversaries. The strategic situation in northern Germany during the winter of 1630 to 1631 resembled a vast chess game, with Gustav, Adolf, and Tilly maneuvering their forces across the frozen landscape in search of decisive advantage. The Swedish king, established in his Pomeranian strongholds, faced the challenge of expanding his territorial base while maintaining his lines of communication with Sweden. Tilly, commanding the combined forces of the Catholic League and the Holy Roman Empire, needed to crush the Swedish intervention before it could gain irreversible momentum. The first major engagement between Swedish and imperial forces occurred at the fortress of Demmin, where a Swedish advance guard encountered a larger imperial detachment. The battle, though relatively small in scale, provided both commanders with crucial intelligence about their enemy's capabilities. Gustav Adolf's forces, employing their characteristic combination of flexible tactics and superior firepower, achieved a tactical victory that cost the Imperials dearly. For Tilly, the engagement confirmed his worst fears about the quality of Swedish military leadership and the effectiveness of their innovations. The psychological warfare that accompanied these early encounters proved as important as the battles themselves. Gustav Adolf understood that his reputation as an invincible commander could be worth several regiments in terms of its impact on enemy morale. The Swedish king cultivated this image through carefully crafted proclamations and strategic displays of mercy toward defeated enemies. Soldiers who surrendered to Swedish forces were treated with unprecedented humanity, a stark contrast to the harsh treatment typically meted out to prisoners of war. This policy of enlightened treatment gradually undermined imperial morale while encouraging defections to the Swedish cause. Tilly's response to these early Swedish successes revealed both his tactical acumen and his growing frustration with an enemy who refused to fight according to established conventions. The imperial commander attempted to lure Gustav Adolf into a major engagement on ground of his choosing, where superior numbers might overcome Swedish tactical advantages. The Swedish king, however, proved too canny to be drawn into such a trap, preferring to maintain his strategic flexibility while building up his forces and expanding his territorial base. The siege of Frankfurt an der Oder in the spring of 1631 marked a turning point in the developing conflict between Swedish and imperial forces. The city, strategically located on the main route between Berlin and Silesia, commanded crucial supply lines for both armies. Gustav Adolf's decision to invest the fortress demonstrated his understanding of the importance of logistics in modern warfare. The Swedish siege works, constructed with unprecedented speed and efficiency, soon reduced the imperial garrison to desperate straits. Tilly's relief effort for Frankfurt an der Oder resulted in the first major battle between the two great commanders. The engagement, fought in the muddy fields outside the city, showcased the revolutionary nature of Swedish military tactics. Gustav Adolf's forces, arranged in their characteristic thin lines and supported by mobile artillery, met Tilly's deep columns with devastating effect. The Swedish cavalry, charging home with sabres drawn rather than wheeling away after firing their pistols, broke through the imperial flanks and sowed panic in the enemy ranks. The victory at Frankfurt an der Oder sent shockwaves through the imperial command structure and established Gustav Adolf as a military genius capable of defeating the most experienced Catholic commanders. The battle's aftermath proved almost as important as the engagement itself, as news of the Swedish victory spread throughout Protestant Germany. Cities and princes who had hesitated to join the Swedish cause now competed to offer their allegiance to the northern liberator. The political impact of military success began to create a virtuous cycle that would accelerate Swedish expansion throughout the German states. For Tilly, the defeat at Frankfurt an der Oder represented more than a tactical setback. It marked the beginning of the end of his legendary reputation. The old commander, who had seemed invincible for so long, now faced an enemy who could match his strategic skill while surpassing his tactical innovation. The psychological impact of this realization would haunt Tilly through the remaining months of his life, as he struggled to develop new strategies to counter the Swedish threat. The ancient city of Magdeburg, Pearl of the Elbe, had stood for centuries as a symbol of German Protestant resistance to Catholic domination. Its Gothic spires pierced the sky like prayers made manifest, while its sturdy walls had withstood countless sieges throughout the tumultuous history of the Holy Roman Empire. In the spring of 1631, as Gustav Adolf's star rose ever higher in the German firmament, Magdeburg became the focus of imperial attention, a Protestant stronghold that threatened to become a Swedish ally and thus upset the delicate balance of power in central Germany. The siege of Magdeburg, begun by imperial forces under General Pappenheim in November 1630, had dragged on through the harsh winter months with neither side able to achieve decisive results. The city's defenders, inspired by their Protestant faith and their hope for Swedish relief, had resisted all attempts at capture with fierce determination. Yet as spring arrived and no Swedish army appeared on the horizon, the morale of the defenders began to waver, and the walls showed increasing signs of the relentless imperial bombardment. Gustav Adolf, fully aware of Magdeburg's strategic importance and symbolic value, had indeed planned to relieve the besieged city. The Swedish king understood that the fall of such a prominent Protestant stronghold would deal a devastating blow to his cause and potentially unravel the coalition of allies he had so carefully constructed. Yet the complex military situation in northern Germany, with imperial forces threatening Swedish communications and Protestant allies proving unreliable, made an immediate relief expedition impossible. The Swedish king's strategic dilemma reflected the broader challenges of intervention in the German conflict. Unlike his Polish campaigns, where Swedish forces operated in familiar territory with secure supply lines, the German intervention required constant attention to political as well as military considerations. Every move Gustav Adolf made was scrutinized by allies and enemies alike, with the potential for diplomatic disaster always lurking beneath tactical success. Tilly's arrival at Magdeburg in early May 1631 tipped the scales decisively against the defenders. The veteran imperial commander, stung by his defeat at Frankfurt an der Oder and determined to achieve a victory that would restore his reputation, threw the full weight of his army against the Protestant stronghold. The final assault, launched on May 20th, 1631, broke through the city's defenses with devastating effect, unleashing a torrent of violence that would echo through the ages. The sack of Magdeburg became one of the most infamous episodes of the 30 Years' War, a byword for the brutality and horror that characterized the conflict. For 3 days, imperial soldiers rampaged through the city, killing, looting, and burning with unrestrained fury. The Protestant defenders, who had held out for so long in hope of Swedish relief, were shown no mercy. The civilian population, caught between the opposing forces, suffered unspeakable horrors as the city was consumed by flames and violence. News of Magdeburg's destruction reached Gustav Adolf's headquarters like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The Swedish king, who had prided himself on his chivalrous conduct of war and his protection of civilian populations, was horrified by the reports of imperial brutality. The destruction of such a prominent Protestant city represented not merely a military defeat, but a moral challenge to everything Gustav Adolf claimed to represent. The king's response to this crisis would define his legacy and shape the remainder of his German campaign. The immediate impact of Magdeburg's fall on Gustav Adolf's position was severe. Protestant princes who had been considering alliance with Sweden now hesitated, fearing that association with the Swedish king might bring similar destruction upon their own cities. The imperial propaganda machine, meanwhile, trumpeted the victory as proof of God's favor for the Catholic cause and the ultimate futility of resistance to imperial authority. For a brief moment, it seemed that Gustav Adolf's entire German strategy might collapse under the weight of this single catastrophe. Yet the Swedish king's response to the Magdeburg disaster revealed the true measure of his character and strategic vision. Rather than retreating into defensive positions or abandoning his German allies, Gustav Adolf chose to transform the tragedy into a rallying cry for the Protestant cause. The king's proclamations to the German people, filled with righteous anger at imperial brutality and solemn promises of vengeance, struck a chord that resonated throughout Protestant Europe. The martyrdom of Magdeburg became a symbol of imperial tyranny and Swedish determination to resist it. The military consequences of Magdeburg's destruction would prove equally significant. Gustav Adolf, freed from the necessity of relieving the city, could now concentrate his forces for a decisive campaign against Tilly's army. The Swedish king understood that only a crushing military victory could restore his reputation and provide the political momentum necessary for continued success. In Germany, the stage was set for the confrontation that would determine the fate of Protestant Europe. The September morning of 1631 dawned crisp and clear over the Saxon countryside. The golden light of early autumn, illuminating the rolling hills and scattered woodlands that stretched toward the horizon. Near the village of Breitenfeld, two armies faced each other across a field that would soon be remembered as one of the most decisive battlefields in European history. Gustav Adolf, the Lion of the North, surveyed the enemy formations with the calculating gaze of a commander who understood that the fate of Protestant Europe hung in the balance of the coming engagement. The Swedish army that prepared for battle at Breitenfeld represented the culmination of Gustav Adolf's military innovations and the finest fighting force in Europe. Nearly 24,000 Swedish and Saxon troops, arranged in the king's characteristic thin lines and supported by the most advanced artillery train on the continent, stood ready to test their mettle against the imperial tercios that had terrorized Germany for more than a decade. The Swedish infantry, their muskets gleaming in the morning sun, carried with them not merely weapons, but the hopes and prayers of Protestant Christians throughout Europe. Tilly's imperial army, numbering over 35,000 men, was arranged in the traditional deep formations that had brought Catholic forces victory after victory in the German wars. The veteran tercios, bristling with pikes and supported by heavy cavalry, presented a formidable sight that had struck fear into the hearts of countless enemies. Yet, as the imperial commander surveyed the Swedish lines, he felt a nagging uncertainty. about the coming battle. The enemy formations looked different, somehow more flexible and responsive than the traditional arrays he was accustomed to facing. The battle began with a thunderous artillery duel that echoed across the Saxon countryside, like the voice of God himself. The Swedish guns, lighter and more maneuverable than their imperial counterparts, could be rapidly repositioned to exploit weaknesses in the enemy line. Gustav Adolf's revolutionary use of artillery as a mobile support weapon rather than a static siege tool became immediately apparent as Swedish gunners poured devastating fire into the densely packed imperial formations. The psychological impact of this unexpected firepower proved as significant as the physical casualties it inflicted. First major crisis of the battle came when the Saxon contingent, overwhelmed by an imperial cavalry charge, broke and fled the field in panic. For a moment, it seemed that Gustav Adolf's entire right flank had collapsed, leaving his army vulnerable to encirclement and destruction. Lesser commanders might have ordered a general retreat, but the Swedish king recognized opportunity within disaster. The flight of the Saxons had actually simplified his tactical situation, allowing him to concentrate his proven Swedish troops against the enemy's main body. Gustav Adolf's response to the Saxon collapse revealed the true genius of his military leadership. Rather than attempting to rally his broken allies, the king ordered his Swedish reserves to wheel and extend their line, creating a new flank that could meet the imperial cavalry charge. The Swedish infantry, trained in the revolutionary tactics their king had developed, executed this complex maneuver with precision that astonished both friend and foe. The sight of Swedish soldiers moving with clockwork precision under extreme pressure would become one of the enduring images of the battle. The decisive moment of the engagement came when Gustav Adolf personally led a cavalry charge against the imperial left flank. The Swedish horsemen, charging home with sabres drawn rather than wheeling away after firing their pistols, smashed through the imperial cavalry and rolled up the enemy line. The king's personal courage, fighting in the front rank alongside his men, inspired the Swedish forces to superhuman efforts while demoralizing the imperial troops who had never seen an enemy commander take such risks. The collapse of the imperial army at Breitenfeld was sudden and complete. The famous tercios, which had seemed invincible for so long, disintegrated under the combined pressure of Swedish firepower and tactical innovation. Tilly himself, wounded in the rout, watched helplessly as his lifetime's work crumbled before his eyes. The imperial casualties, numbering in the thousands, testified to the devastating effectiveness of Swedish military methods. More importantly, the victory at Breitenfeld shattered the myth of Catholic military superiority and announced to Europe that a new power had emerged in the north. The aftermath of Breitenfeld transformed the heterostrategic situation in Germany overnight. Protestant princes who had wavered in their allegiance to Gustav Adolf now competed to offer their support to the victorious Swedish king. The road to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire lay open, and with it, the possibility of reshaping the religious and political balance of Europe. The battle that had begun as a desperate gamble to restore Swedish prestige had become the foundation for a new European order. For Gustav Adolf, the victory at Breitenfeld represented validation of his military theories and confirmation of his destiny as the champion of Protestant Europe. The Swedish king, who had landed at Peenemünde as an untested foreign invader now, stood as the most feared and respected commander on the continent. The golden age of Swedish military might had begun, and with it, the transformation of a northern kingdom into a great European empire. The autumn winds that swept across the battlefield. After the guns fell silent, carried with them the echoes of this revolutionary victory. In the growing darkness, as Swedish soldiers gathered the spoils of their triumph and imperial survivors struggled homeward through the night, the very foundations of European power trembled. The world had witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare and the rise of a new kind of king. The age of Swedish greatness had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The cannon smoke had barely cleared from the fields of Lutzen when the weight of empire settled upon shoulders too young to bear it. In the royal chambers of Stockholm, 6-year-old Christina sat upon a throne that seemed to dwarf her small form, while around her the most powerful men in Sweden gathered like winter wolves, their eyes sharp with ambition and their voices heavy with the burden of regency. Axel Oxenstierna stood at the center of this gathering storm, his weathered face carved from the same granite that built Sweden's castles. He had been Gustav Adolf's closest advisor, the architect of administrative reforms that had transformed a northern kingdom into a European power. Now, with his king dead on German soil and an empire stretching from the Baltic to the Rhine, he faced the most delicate task of his long career, holding together a realm that threatened to fracture under the weight of its own sudden greatness. The Council of Regency moved through the winter months of 1632 like shadows across snow, making decisions that would echo through generations. They faced enemies on every border, the defeated but unbroken forces of the Holy Roman Empire, the calculating gaze of France, the ever-present threat of Denmark, and the vast, brooding presence of Russia to the east. Yet perhaps the greatest challenge lay not in foreign courts, but in the very heart of Sweden itself, where nobles who had grown wealthy on war spoils now questioned whether a child and her guardians could maintain the empire their Lion King had carved from blood and steel. Oxenstierna's genius lay not in grand gestures, but in the patient work of administration. While other regents might have sought to consolidate power through spectacle, he chose instead the quieter path of institutional strength. He strengthened the Swedish administrative system, ensuring that the machinery of empire could function, whether guided by a warrior king or a council of ministers. The provincial governors, the tax collectors, the military commanders all were bound together by a web of loyalty and law that transcended the personality of any single ruler. Through the long northern winters, as snow blanketed the empire from Stockholm to Pomerania, the Regency worked tirelessly to maintain Sweden's position in the complex chess game of European politics. The 30 Years' War continued to rage across the German states, but now Swedish armies fought not for the glory of Gustav Adolf, but for the more abstract concept of Swedish interests. This subtle shift in motivation would prove crucial to the empire's survival, for it meant that Sweden's power was no longer dependent on the martial prowess of a single, extraordinary individual. The young queen, Christina, meanwhile, grew up in a world where power was both absolute and fragile. Her tutors included the finest minds of Europe's scholars, who had fled the wars ravaging the continent, bringing with them libraries of knowledge and wisdom earned through suffering. She learned Latin and Greek, studied the histories of ancient empires, and absorbed the lessons of statecraft from men who had watched kingdoms rise and fall like wheat before the scythe. As she matured, Christina displayed an intellectual curiosity that both impressed and worried her guardians. She corresponded with philosophers and scientists, collected rare manuscripts with the fervor of a true scholar, and showed little interest in the traditional pastimes of royalty. While other young queens might have been content with needlework and court ceremonies, Christina devoured books on military strategy, engaged in theological debates with Lutheran ministers, and demonstrated an independence of thought that would later transform both her reign and her life. The Regency years also saw the consolidation of Sweden's Baltic Empire. The territories conquered during Gustav Adolf's campaigns, Livonia, parts of Pomerania, were gradually integrated into the Swedish administrative system. Swedish law replaced local customs, Swedish officials took control of local governments, and Swedish merchants established trading networks that stretched from Gothenburg to Riga. This was empire building of a different sort from the dramatic conquests of the Lion King, but it was perhaps more lasting in its effects. The wealth that flowed into Sweden during these years was staggering. The copper mines of Falun, already among the richest in Europe, were supplemented by the tributes and taxes extracted from conquered territories. The great iron deposits of Bergslagen provided the raw material for cannons and muskets that armed not only Swedish soldiers, but also the armies of Sweden's allies. The forests of northern Sweden, seemingly endless expanses of pine and fir, were harvested to build the ships that carried Swedish power across the Baltic and beyond. Yet with wealth came corruption, and with power came the temptation to abuse it. The Swedish nobility, enriched by war spoils and elevated by military service, began to develop tastes and ambitions that would eventually challenge the very foundations of royal authority. Great estates were carved from conquered lands. Magnificent palaces rose in the Swedish countryside, and aristocratic families accumulated wealth that rivaled the treasuries of smaller kingdoms. Oxenstierna watched these developments with the calculating eye of a master politician. He understood that the nobility's wealth was both a strength and a weakness of strength, because it bound them to the empire's continued success. A weakness because it made them potential rivals to royal power. His solution was characteristically subtle. He created new honors and titles, established formal precedents, rankings, and channeled aristocratic ambition into service to the crown. The Swedish nobility became not just wealthy landowners, but active participants in the empire's governance. The religious dimension of Swedish imperial policy also evolved during the Regency years. While Gustav Adolf had been a sincere Lutheran whose faith had driven much of his intervention in the 30 Years' War, the Regency took a more pragmatic approach to religious questions. Swedish officials in conquered territories learned to work with Catholic populations, Orthodox communities, and various Protestant sects, developing a model of religious tolerance that was revolutionary for its time, not because it was based on principle, but because it was based on practical necessity. As the 1640s progressed, the young Queen Christina began to take a more active role in government affairs. Her interventions in council meetings were initially tentative, but they gradually became more confident and more decisive. She demonstrated an ability to grasp complex issues quickly, to see connections between seemingly unrelated problems, and to propose solutions that surprised even her most experienced advisors. The transition from regency to personal rule was managed with typical Swedish efficiency. There was no dramatic ceremony, no sudden assumption of power, but rather a gradual shift in the balance of authority. By 1644, when Christina officially assumed full royal powers, she had already been making significant decisions for months. The continuity of Swedish policy was maintained, but the personality of the ruler began to subtly reshape the empire's direction. Queen Christina's personal reign began not with the clash of arms, but with the gentle rustling of manuscript pages and the soft scratch of scholarly quills. Her court became a magnet for the intellectual elite of Europe, drawing philosophers, scientists, artists, and writers who transformed Stockholm into a northern Athens. The palace that had once echoed with the planning of military campaigns now resonated with debates on natural philosophy, discussions of classical literature, and the passionate arguments of men and women who believed that knowledge could reshape the world. The Queen's patronage of learning was not merely ornamental, but reflected a deeper understanding of power's true sources. She recognized that Swedish military dominance, impressive as it was, rested on foundations that could be shaken by a single lost battle or the death of a key commander. Intellectual and cultural influence, by contrast, could outlast armies and survive the fall of dynasties. She sought to make Sweden not just a military power, but a civilizational force, a beacon of learning that would attract the best minds of Europe to her northern kingdom. René Descartes, the great French philosopher, accepted Christina's invitation to join her court in 1649. His arrival in Stockholm marked the apotheosis of the Queen's intellectual ambitions. Here was the man who had revolutionized mathematics and philosophy, who had taught Europe to think in new ways about the relationship between mind and matter, between reason and faith. His presence in the Swedish capital was a symbol of the empire's cultural maturity, proof that Sweden had evolved beyond its origins as a warrior state to become a patron of the highest forms of human achievement. The philosophical discussions between Christina and Descartes took place in the early hours of the morning, in the Queen's private chambers, where the concerns of empire could be momentarily set aside for the pure pursuit of truth. They debated the nature of the soul, the existence of God, the foundations of mathematical certainty, and the proper relationship between ruler and ruled. These conversations, conducted in the semi-darkness of northern winter mornings, represented something unprecedented in European history, a reigning monarch engaging as an intellectual equal with the greatest philosopher of the age. Yet the harsh Swedish climate proved too much for Descartes' constitution. The bitter cold of the 1649 to 1650 winter, combined with the early morning hours of his philosophical discussions with the Queen, weakened his health. When he died in February 1650, Christina was devastated. She had lost not just a brilliant advisor, but a kindred spirit who had understood her vision of Sweden as an intellectual empire. His death marked the beginning of a period of profound personal crisis for the Queen, one that would ultimately lead to the most shocking decision of her reign. The intellectual ferment of Christina's court had unintended consequences for Swedish imperial policy. The Queen's fascination with learning led her to question not just philosophical abstractions, but also the practical foundations of her own rule. She began to examine the religious basis of Swedish power, to question the Lutheran orthodoxy that had justified her father's wars, and to explore alternative forms of Christianity that promised different answers to the fundamental questions of human existence. This intellectual journey gradually led Christina toward Catholicism, a development that shocked her advisors and threatened the very foundations of Swedish imperial ideology. Sweden had positioned itself as the champion of Protestant Europe, the defender of religious freedom against Catholic tyranny. The idea that Sweden's own queen might convert to the enemy faith was almost incomprehensible to her subjects. Yet, Christina found herself increasingly drawn to Catholic theology, Catholic art, and Catholic spirituality. The Queen's religious evolution was paralleled by a growing distaste for the mundane aspects of royal power. The endless council meetings, the petty disputes between nobles, the constant need to balance competing interests, all of this began to seem increasingly meaningless to a woman who had tasted the pure pleasure of intellectual discourse. She longed for a life devoted entirely to learning and spiritual exploration, free from the burdens of imperial responsibility. Meanwhile, the Swedish Empire continued to expand and consolidate its power. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 had confirmed Sweden's position as a major European power, granting it formal recognition of its German territories and establishing it as a guarantor of the new European order. Swedish diplomats worked tirelessly to maintain the delicate balance of alliances that preserved their empire's security, while Swedish merchants extended their trading networks ever further across the Baltic and beyond. The economic foundations of Swedish power were also strengthened during Christina's reign. The Queen's intellectual interests led her to patronize not just philosophers and artists, but also practical innovators who improved Swedish mining techniques, developed new methods of iron production, and created more efficient systems of agricultural management. The empire's wealth continued to grow, providing the resources necessary to maintain large armies and extensive diplomatic networks. Yet beneath the surface, tensions were building that would eventually threaten the empire's stability. The cost of maintaining Swedish power was enormous, requiring constant taxation and military service that strained the patience of both nobles and commoners. The conquered territories, while profitable, also created ongoing security challenges that demanded constant attention and resources. The very success of Swedish imperialism had created problems that would prove increasingly difficult to solve. Christina's growing disillusionment with royal power became increasingly obvious to her closest advisors. She began to speak openly about her desire to abdicate, to abandon the throne in favor of a life devoted to learning and spiritual contemplation. Such talk was deeply disturbing to men who had spent their lives building and maintaining the Swedish Empire, who saw in their queen's intellectual pretensions a dangerous threat to everything they had achieved. The succession question became urgent as Christina's intentions became clearer. She had refused all suggestions of marriage, showing no interest in providing an heir to continue the Vasa dynasty. Instead, she began to promote her cousin Charles Gustav, Duke of Zweibrücken, as her successor. Charles Gustav was everything that Christina was: skilled military commander, a practical administrator, and a man who understood power in terms of territory conquered and enemies defeated rather than books, read, and philosophical problems. Solved. The contrast between the two cousins was stark and deeply symbolic. Christina represented the intellectual flowering of Swedish power, the transformation of a warrior state into a patron of learning and culture. Charles Gustav embodied the older Swedish tradition of military conquest and territorial expansion. The choice between them would determine not just the future of the Swedish monarchy, but the future direction of the Swedish Empire itself. As the 1650s progressed, Christina's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She would disappear, for days at a time, closeted in her private chambers with her books and manuscripts. She showed little interest in affairs of state, leaving practical decisions to her advisors while she pursued her scholarly interests. The empire continued to function, but its direction was increasingly unclear. The Queen's religious conversion, which she had kept secret from all but her closest confidants, was finally revealed in a series of private meetings with Catholic priests, who had been secretly admitted to the Swedish court. The theological discussions that followed were intense and passionate, as Christina sought to resolve the intellectual and spiritual questions that had been troubling her for years. The priests, amazed to find themselves debating theology with the Queen of Sweden, worked carefully to guide her toward a full embrace of Catholic doctrine. The political implications of Christina's conversion were staggering. Sweden's entire imperial project was based on its role as the defender of Protestant Europe. The Queen's conversion would not only undermine Swedish diplomatic relations, but also threaten the loyalty of Swedish subjects who had been taught to see Catholicism as the enemy of their faith and their freedom. The empire that Gustav Adolf had built on the foundation of religious war threatened to crumble under the weight of his daughter's religious conversion. In the end, Christina's solution was characteristically dramatic and absolute. Rather than attempt to reconcile her personal beliefs with her public responsibilities, she chose to abandon the throne altogether. The abdication, when it came in 1654, was carried out with theatrical flair that both reflected Christina's personality and marked the end of an era in Swedish history. She had ruled for 22 years, 10 of them as regent and 12 as queen in her own right. But she left behind an empire that was fundamentally different from the one she had inherited. Charles Gustav ascended to the Swedish throne in 1654. With the weight of empire pressing upon his shoulders and the expectations of a nation that had grown accustomed to military glory. Where his predecessor had been a scholar and a dreamer, he was a soldier and a pragmatist, trained in the arts of war and administration by some of the finest military minds in Europe. The contrast could not have been more complete. Christina had sought to transform Sweden into an intellectual beacon, while Charles Gustav viewed the empire as a machine for projecting power and expanding territory. The new king's first challenge was not external but internal. Christina's abdication had created a crisis of legitimacy that threatened to destabilize the entire Swedish political system. The nobles who had grown wealthy under the previous regime wondered whether their privileges would be maintained under the new king. The common people, who had borne the burden of constant taxation and military service, questioned whether the endless cycle of war and conquest was worth the sacrifice. The empire's enemies, watching from their courts and capitals, sensed weakness and began to probe for opportunities to strike. Charles Gustav's response to these challenges was swift and decisive. He began by reassuring the Swedish nobility that their privileges would be respected and their service valued. He confirmed the appointments of key administrators and military commanders, ensuring continuity in the empire's governance. He also moved quickly to address the empire's financial problems, implementing reforms that increased tax collection efficiency while reducing the burden on the common people through more equitable distribution of costs. The king's military background proved invaluable in these early months of his reign. He understood that Swedish power ultimately rested on the empire's ability to project force across the Baltic and beyond, and he moved quickly to modernize and expand the Swedish armed forces. New regiments were raised, new weapons were purchased, and new fortifications were constructed to defend the empire's extended borders. The Swedish military, which had begun to decline during the later years of Christina's reign, was revitalized under its new commander, Chief. Yet Charles Gustav's greatest challenge lay not in Sweden itself, but in the complex web of European politics that had emerged from the 30 Years' War. The Peace of Westphalia had established a new balance of power that was inherently unstable, creating opportunities for aggressive powers to expand their influence while threatening established empires with decline or dismemberment. Sweden's position as a guarantor of the Westphalian settlement gave it significant diplomatic influence, but it also made it a target for powers that sought to overturn the post-war order. The king's first major test came in Poland-Lithuania, where the throne had become vacant following the death of King Władysław IV. the Polish nobility, divided by religious and political differences, struggled to elect a new monarch while the country faced threats from multiple directions. Swedish involvement in Polish affairs was almost inevitable. Given the empire's extensive Baltic territories and its long history of conflict with Polish forces, what was less clear was whether Sweden would intervene as a mediator or as a conqueror. Charles Gustav's decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Poland-Lithuania in 1655 marked the beginning of what would later be known as the First Northern War. The operation was planned with characteristic Swedish efficiency, combining rapid military movement with careful diplomatic preparation. Swedish forces moved south from their Baltic strongholds, while Swedish diplomats worked to neutralize potential enemies and secure the support of potential allies. The invasion itself was a masterpiece of military planning and execution. Swedish armies, led by seasoned commanders who had learned their trade in the German campaigns of the 30 Years' War, swept through Polish territory with devastating effectiveness. The Polish army, weakened by years of internal conflict and unprepared for the scale and speed of the Swedish assault, offered little effective resistance. City after city fell to the Swedish advance, and within months Charles Gustav found himself master of much of Poland-Lithuania. The conquest of Poland-Lithuania represented the high point of Swedish military power. The empire now stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea territories controlled by Polish vassals. Swedish administrators took control of Polish cities. Swedish merchants established trading posts in conquered territories, and Swedish soldiers garrisoned fortresses that controlled the major trade routes of Eastern Europe. Yet the very scale of Swedish success created new problems that would ultimately prove more difficult to solve than the original conquest. The Polish nobility, despite their military defeat, never fully accepted Swedish rule. Underground resistance movements emerged in conquered territories, attacking Swedish officials and disrupting Swedish administration. The Catholic Church, which had been a pillar of Polish identity, became a focus of resistance to Swedish Protestant rule. The international reaction to Sweden's Polish conquest was swift and alarmed. The major powers of Europe, who had accepted Swedish dominance in the Baltic as a fait accompli, were not prepared to see Sweden establish hegemony over all of Eastern Europe. Russia, in particular, viewed the Swedish conquest of Poland-Lithuania as a direct threat to its own security and began to mobilize forces for a counterattack. The Holy Roman Empire, while weakened by the 30 Years' War, still possessed significant resources and began to consider military intervention to prevent Swedish domination of Central Europe. Charles Gustav's response to these challenges was characteristically aggressive. Rather than consolidate his Polish conquests and negotiate from a position of strength, he decided to expand the war by attacking Denmark. The Danish kingdom, which controlled the strategically crucial sound between the Baltic and North Seas, had long been Sweden's most consistent enemy. Charles Gustav calculated that a successful war against Denmark would eliminate Sweden's greatest regional rival, while securing control of the Baltic trade routes that were essential to Swedish prosperity. The war against Denmark, which began in 1657, demonstrated both the heights of Swedish military capability and the limits of Swedish imperial ambition. The initial Swedish assault was devastatingly successful, with Swedish forces quickly overrunning much of the Danish peninsula and threatening Copenhagen itself. The Danish king, Frederick III, found himself in a position similar to that of the Polish nobles militarily defeated, but politically determined to resist. Swedish domination, the most spectacular moment of the Danish War, came in the winter of 1658, when Charles Gustav made the audacious decision to march his army across the frozen waters of the Great Belt. The Swedish forces, moving across the ice under cover of darkness, achieved complete tactical surprise and forced the Danish government to negotiate from a position of desperate weakness. The subsequent Treaty of Roskilde was a triumph of Swedish diplomacy, securing territorial concessions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Yet the very boldness of the ice march, while militarily successful, also revealed the underlying fragility of Swedish power. The operation had succeeded because of exceptional weather conditions and the extraordinary skill of Swedish commanders, but it could not be repeated at will. The Swedish Empire, despite its impressive territorial extent, was ultimately dependent on the limited population and resources of the Swedish homeland. Every major military operation strained these resources to their limits. The Treaty of Roskilde, signed in February 1658, represented the zenith of Swedish imperial power. The empire now controlled virtually the entire Baltic Sea, with Swedish territories extending from Finland in the north to Pomerania in the south, from Estonia in the east to newly conquered Danish provinces in the west. Swedish naval forces dominated the Baltic trade routes. Swedish merchants controlled the flow of goods between Western and Eastern Europe, and Swedish diplomats were courted by every major power in Europe. Yet Charles Gustav was not content with these achievements. The king, perhaps intoxicated by his military successes, or perhaps calculating that Swedish power was too fragile to maintain without constant expansion, decided to resume the war against Denmark. This decision, made in the summer of 1658, would prove to be the fatal error that began the decline of Swedish imperial power. The renewed Danish war was a strategic disaster for Sweden. The Danish government, having used the respite provided by the Treaty of Roskilde to rebuild its military forces and secure international support, proved far more formidable than in the previous year. Dutch naval forces, concerned about Swedish control of the Baltic trade, intervened on behalf of Denmark. The Holy Roman Empire, increasingly alarmed by Swedish expansion, began to mobilize forces to support the Danish cause. Charles Gustav found himself fighting a multi-front war against a coalition of enemies who were determined to prevent Swedish hegemony over Northern Europe. The Swedish military, despite its skill and experience, was simply too small to fight effectively on multiple fronts, while maintaining control of the empire's extensive territories. The king's health, undermined by years of campaigning and the enormous stress of managing a vast empire, began to fail at the crucial moment when Swedish fortunes hung in the balance. The king's death in February 1660, while besieging Copenhagen, marked the end of an era in Swedish history. Charles Gustav had ruled for less than 6 years, but in that brief period he had expanded the Swedish Empire to its greatest territorial extent, while simultaneously setting in motion the forces that would eventually lead to its decline. His death left the empire in the hands of his infant son, Charles XI, with all the instability and uncertainty that a regency period inevitably brought. The death of Charles Gustav cast a shadow over the Swedish Empire that seemed to stretch across the Baltic like gathering storm clouds. In the royal palace at Stockholm, 4-year-old Charles XI sat beneath the weight of a crown that had become both blessing and curse, while around him the great nobles of Sweden gathered once again to form a regency council. The pattern was familiar: child monarch, a council of ambitious men, and an empire that stretched far beyond the ability of any single nation to control indefinitely. The regency that took power in 1660 faced challenges that would have tested the abilities of Gustav Adolf himself. The First Northern War was still raging, with Swedish forces locked in desperate combat against a coalition of enemies that included Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and the Holy Roman Empire. The empire's finances, strained by decades of constant warfare, were approaching the point of collapse. The Swedish population, bled white by continuous military service and crushing taxation, was showing signs of exhaustion that threatened the very foundations of imperial power. Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie, the most powerful man in the Regency Council, understood that Sweden faced a fundamental choice between imperial ambition and national survival. The empire that had been built through 3 generations of military conquest and diplomatic brilliance was simply too large and too expensive to maintain with the resources available to a sparsely populated northern kingdom. Yet the alternatives, territorial concessions, diplomatic retreat, the acknowledgement of Swedish limitations, were almost unthinkable to men who had spent their lives expanding. Swedish power, the regent's solution, was characteristically Swedish. Maintain the empire's essential positions while abandoning its most exposed territories. The Peace of Oliva in 1660, which ended the First Northern War, represented a masterpiece of diplomatic damage control. Sweden retained its Baltic dominance while giving up its most costly territorial acquisitions. The empire emerged from the war smaller but more defensible, poorer but more stable, diminished but not destroyed. Yet the costs of this pragmatic approach were enormous. The Swedish nobility, which had grown wealthy on the spoils of conquest, found itself facing reduced incomes and diminished opportunities. The Swedish army, which had been the instrument of imperial expansion, was forced to accept smaller budgets and fewer campaigns. The Swedish people, who had been told that their sacrifices were building a great empire, discovered that their empire was contracting rather than expanding. The Regency years also witnessed the emergence of new challenges that would plague the Swedish Empire for generations. The rise of Russian power under Tsar Alexis I created a formidable enemy on Sweden's eastern border, one that possessed the population and resources to challenge Swedish dominance in the Baltic. The consolidation of Prussian power in northern Germany threatened Swedish control of the German territories that had been so costly to acquire and maintain. The growing strength of the Dutch Republic created a naval rival that could challenge Swedish control of Baltic trade routes. Perhaps most importantly, the Regency period saw the beginning of a financial crisis that would eventually cripple Swedish imperial power. The empire's expenses, military forces, administrative costs, diplomatic missions continued to grow even as its revenues declined. The Swedish crown was forced to resort to increasingly desperate expedients to raise money, selling noble titles, mortgaging crown lands, debasing the currency, and imposing taxes that pushed the Swedish population to the brink of rebellion. The young King Charles XI, growing up in this atmosphere of imperial decline, received an education that was very different from that of his predecessors. Where Gustav Adolf had been trained as a conqueror and Christina as a scholar, Charles XI was taught to think like an administrator and financial manager. His tutors emphasized the importance of efficiency, economy, and careful resource management, rather than military glory or intellectual achievement. The cultural atmosphere of the Regency period reflected these changing priorities. The intellectual brilliance of Christina's court was replaced by a more sober focus on practical governance. The great palaces and artistic projects of the early empire were maintained but not expanded. The Swedish nobility, while still wealthy, by European standards, began to adopt a more restrained lifestyle that reflected the empire's reduced circumstances. The Regency also oversaw significant changes in Swedish military organization. The traditional system of foreign recruitment, which had provided the manpower for Swedish conquests, was gradually replaced by a more systematic approach to domestic conscription. The new system, while more efficient and less expensive, also represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the Swedish state and its citizens. Military service became a universal obligation rather than a voluntary profession, binding the entire population to the empire's defense. The economic reforms of the Regency period were equally significant. The Swedish government began to take a more active role in promoting domestic industry and agriculture, recognizing that the empire's long-term survival depended on developing internal resources rather than relying on foreign conquest. New mining techniques were introduced, new agricultural methods were promoted, and new manufacturing industries were established with government support. Yet these reforms, while necessary for the empire's survival, also created new tensions within Swedish society. The traditional nobility, accustomed to wealth derived from military service and foreign conquest, found itself increasingly displaced by a new class of administrators, merchants, and manufacturers. The Swedish peasantry, burdened by increased taxation and military service, began to question whether the empire's survival was worth the sacrifices being demanded of them. The Regency period also witnessed important developments in Swedish foreign policy. The empire's diplomats, recognizing that Sweden could no longer compete with larger powers through military force alone, began to develop new strategies based on balance of power politics and careful alliance management. Sweden increasingly positioned itself as a mediator between competing powers rather than as a conqueror seeking new territories. This diplomatic evolution was reflected in Sweden's relationship with France, which became increasingly important. During the Regency years, the French government, seeking to prevent the emergence of a dominant power in Central Europe, provided financial subsidies and diplomatic support that helped Sweden maintain its position despite its military weakness. The Swedish-French alliance, while pragmatic rather than ideological, provided the empire with the external support it needed to survive the challenges of the Regency period. The young king's education in these years emphasized the importance of personal royal authority as the foundation of imperial power. His tutors, many of whom had witnessed the chaos and inefficiency of Regency government, taught him that strong monarchical leadership was essential for the empire's survival. This lesson would prove crucial when Charles XI eventually assumed personal control of the Swedish government. As the Regency period drew to a close in the early 1670s, the Swedish Empire had been fundamentally transformed. The aggressive expansionism of the early 17th century had been replaced by defensive consolidation. The military adventurism of Gustav Adolf and Charles Gustav had given way to careful diplomacy and financial management. The empire had survived its greatest crisis, but it had also lost much of the dynamism and ambition that had made it a great power. The coronation of Charles XI in 1672 marked the end of the Regency period and the beginning of a new chapter in Swedish imperial history. The young king, now 27 years old, brought to the throne a combination of personal authority and practical experience that his predecessors had lacked. He understood both the potential and the limitations of Swedish power, and he was determined to use both to ensure the empire's survival in an increasingly dangerous world. The empire that Charles XI inherited was both stronger and weaker than the one his father had left behind. It was stronger because it had been consolidated and rationalized, its administration improved, its finances stabilized, and its military forces modernized. It was weaker because it had lost much of its territorial extent. Its population was exhausted by decades of warfare, and its enemies were growing stronger while Sweden struggled to maintain its position. Yet the young king was determined to prove that Swedish power could endure. The empire that had been built by conquest would be preserved by careful management, intelligent diplomacy, and the gradual development of internal resources. The age of military adventure was ending, but the age of administrative efficiency was beginning. The Swedish Empire would continue to play a major role in European politics, but it would do so through subtlety and skill rather than through the raw exercise of military force. The transformation of Swedish imperial culture during the Regency period was perhaps most evident in the changing character of the Swedish nobility. The warrior aristocrats who had conquered half of Europe were being replaced by court officials and provincial administrators who understood that their fortunes depended on the empire's stability rather than its expansion. This new nobility was more cautious, more calculating, and more willing to compromise than their predecessors. But they were also more sophisticated in their understanding of power and more skilled in its exercise. The Regency period thus marked a crucial transition in Swedish imperial history. The empire had passed through its greatest crisis and emerged diminished but intact. The foundations had been laid for a new kind of Swedish power, one based on internal strength rather than external conquest, on administrative efficiency rather than military glory, on diplomatic skill rather than battlefield prowess. The empire would continue to face challenges in the years ahead, but it would face them with new tools and new strategies that reflected the lessons learned during the difficult years of the Regency. As the snow began to fall over Stockholm in the winter of 1672, coating the palace roofs and the ancient streets in pristine white, the Swedish Empire stood at a crossroads. The young king, now secure upon his throne, looked out over a realm that stretched from the Arctic forests to the German plains, from the Baltic Islands to the Russian borderlands. It was still a great empire, still a force to be reckoned with. In European politics, still a testament to the extraordinary achievements of the Swedish people. But it was also an empire that had learned the limits of its power, had discovered the costs of its ambitions, and had chosen survival over glory as the supreme goal of imperial policy. The bells of Stockholm Cathedral rang out across the winter landscape, their bronze voices carrying the news of the king's coronation to every corner of the empire. In the great hall of the palace, the Swedish nobility gathered to pledge their loyalty to their new monarch, their voices joining in ancient oaths that bound them to the service of the crown. Outside, in the streets and squares of the capital, the Swedish people celebrated the end of the Regency period and the beginning of what they hoped would be a new era of prosperity and peace. Yet even as the celebrations continued through the long northern night, the challenges facing the Swedish Empire were already gathering on the horizon. The great powers of Europe were stirring, new alliances were forming, and the delicate balance of power that had preserved Swedish independence was beginning to shift. The empire that had reached its zenith under Charles Gustav was about to face its greatest test under Charles XI, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of Sweden, but the future of the entire Baltic region. The rise of the Swedish Empire which had begun with the dreams of Gustav Vasa and reached its climax with the conquests of Gustav Adolf and Charles Gustav, was entering its final phase. The empire would continue to endure for another century, would continue to play a significant role in European politics, would continue to be a major Baltic power. But the age of Swedish greatness, the brief and brilliant period when a small northern kingdom had dominated the politics of half of Europe, was drawing to a close. The empire that had risen so dramatically was beginning the long, slow process of decline that would eventually reduce it to the dimensions of a regional power. This was the Sweden that Charles XI inherited, an empire in transition, a power in decline, a nation struggling to maintain its greatness in the face of changing circumstances. The young king's reign would be marked by his efforts to arrest this decline, to restore Swedish power, and to ensure that the empire his ancestors had built would survive for future generations. Whether he would succeed in these efforts remained to be seen, but his determination to try would shape the final chapter of Swedish imperial history. The royal proclamation echoed through the halls of Stockholm Castle like the measured toll of a church bell, each word carrying the weight of centuries. Charles XI, barely 15 years old, stood before the assembled nobles of the realm, his youthful frame somehow containing the accumulated authority of his ancestors. The regency that had guided Sweden through the uncertain years following his father's death was ending, and with it, an era of compromise and accommodation with the aristocracy. The young king's eyes, already bearing the penetrating gaze that would define his reign, surveyed the assembled magnates with quiet calculation. These men had grown wealthy during the years of his minority, their estates bloated with lands that had once belonged to the crown. They had governed Sweden as if it were their personal domain, parceling out privileges and territories with the casual generosity of those who spend another's wealth. Now, as autumn winds swept across the Baltic, carrying with them the scent of change, Charles XI prepared to reclaim what was his by right. The Great Reduction began not with the thunder of cannon or the clash of steel, but with the quiet scratching of quills upon parchment. In the chancellery of Stockholm Castle, royal secretaries worked by candlelight, their careful script documenting decades of royal generosity that had transformed Sweden's nobility from servants of the crown into its masters. Estate by estate, donation by donation, they compiled the vast catalogue of lands that had passed from royal to private hands, a hemorrhage of wealth that had left the monarchy financially crippled while enriching those who served it. Charles XI understood what his predecessors had perhaps forgotten, that true power lay not in the loyalty of men, but in the control of land. The nobles who had grown fat on royal largesse during the Regency years had become not servants but competitors, their vast estates generating revenues that rivaled those of the crown itself. They maintained private armies, built palatial residences, and lived with a magnificence that bordered on the regal. In their prosperity, the king saw not success but treason, the slow, bloodless conquest of royal authority by those who professed to serve it. The process began with meticulous legal examination. Royal lawyers, men whose loyalty was purchased, not with land but with salary, pored over ancient charters and donation documents. They discovered what Charles XI had suspected, that many of the grants made during times of weakness contained clauses that allowed for their revocation. Medieval kings, even in their desperation, had been cunning enough to plant seeds of future recovery in the very documents that recorded their temporary defeats. The first estates to be reclaimed were those whose owners had committed the most egregious acts of disloyalty. Count Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie, whose magnificent castle at Lich had become a symbol of noble excess, found his vast holdings scrutinized with the cold precision of an accountant's ledger. The same man who had once stood as regent, ruling Sweden in the name of its child king, now discovered that his wealth had been built upon foundations of legal sand. De la Gardie's fall from grace became a cautionary tale whispered throughout the noble houses of Sweden. His libraries, filled with books purchased with royal gold, his art collections assembled with money that had once belonged to the crown, his very lifestyle supported by estates that had been granted in moments of royal weakness, all of it was methodically catalogued and reclaimed. The Count, who had once entertained foreign ambassadors with a splendor that rivaled that of kings, found himself reduced to a modest income, his political influence evaporating like morning mist. The nobility's response to these measures revealed the depth of their transformation from servants to masters. They did not petition humbly for mercy or acknowledge the justice of the king's claims. Instead, they gathered in their great houses, their faces flushed with indignation, speaking of their rights and privileges, as if the crown's own property had somehow become theirs by divine decree. Their very outrage demonstrated how far they had drifted from the ancient understanding that all land ultimately belonged to the king. But Charles XI was not his father, nor was he the weak child they had governed during the Regency. He moved with the calculated patience of a master chess player, never seizing so much at once as to provoke open rebellion, but never allowing his opponents to rest in false security. Estate by estate, charter by charter, he dismantled the economic foundations of noble power, transforming Sweden's aristocracy from independent magnates into dependent courtiers. The process was not without its moments of high drama. When the proud Count Nils Brahe, whose family had served Swedish kings for generations, received notice that his estates were to be examined for possible reduction, he appeared at court in full ceremonial armor, as if preparing for battle. The symbolism was not lost on those who witnessed it. Here was a man who had forgotten that his sword was meant to serve the crown, not challenge it. Charles XI received the Count with the cold courtesy that had become his trademark. He listened to Brahe's passionate defense of his family's honor, his recitation of services rendered to the crown, his appeals to tradition and precedent. When the Count had finished, the king's response was delivered with the quiet finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Your family has indeed served the crown faithfully. Now you will serve it once more, by returning what was given in temporary need to its rightful owner. The Great Reduction transformed not only the economic structure of Sweden but the very nature of its monarchy. Where previous kings had ruled through negotiation and compromise, balancing the interests of competing noble factions, Charles XI created a system in which the crown stood alone at the apex of power. The wealth that flowed back to royal coffers funded not only the expansion of the military, but the creation of a professional bureaucracy that owed its existence entirely to the king. Foreign observers watched these developments with a mixture of admiration and alarm. The French ambassador, accustomed to the factional politics of Versailles, marveled at the efficiency with which the Swedish king had neutralized his nobility. The English envoy, representing a nation where Parliament had recently demonstrated its power over kings, sent worried dispatches about the consolidation of royal authority in Stockholm. But Charles XI paid little attention to foreign opinions. He was building something that would outlast diplomatic fashion, state capable of projecting power across the Baltic and beyond. The reduced nobility found themselves in a position that would have been familiar to their medieval ancestors, but seemed strange and humiliating to men who had grown accustomed to independence. They were once again courtiers, dependent upon royal favor for their status and security. Their great houses, no longer supported by vast estates, became modest residences. Their political influence, once derived from personal wealth and private armies, now flowed entirely from their ability to serve the crown effectively. Some adapted to this new reality with grace, discovering that service to an absolute monarch could be more rewarding than the precarious independence they had previously enjoyed. Others retreated into bitter obscurity, nursing grievances that would be passed down through generations like family heirlooms. But all understood that Sweden had entered a new age, one in which the king's will was not simply one voice among many, but the single source of legitimate authority. The wealth that flowed back to the crown through the Great Reduction was not allowed to rest idle in royal treasuries. Charles XI, with the systematic mind that characterized all his reforms, immediately directed these resources toward the creation of a military machine that would make Sweden the terror of its enemies and the envy of its allies. The king understood that power without the means to project it was merely an illusion, and he was determined that Sweden would never again be forced to rely upon the uncertain loyalty of allies or the temporary favor of foreign powers. The transformation of Sweden's military began with the establishment of the allotment system, a revolutionary approach to maintaining armed forces that would influence military organization across Europe. Instead of relying upon foreign mercenaries or the uncertain feudal obligations of noble vassals, Charles XI created a system in which each parish in Sweden was responsible for maintaining a soldier. The farmer who provided for this soldier's needs received certain tax exemptions in return, creating a direct link between the productive capacity of the nation and the strength of its military. This system produced soldiers who were not merely hired guns fighting for pay, but men with deep roots in Swedish soil and genuine loyalty to the crown that protected their families and communities. When these soldiers marched to war, they carried with them not only the professional skills of trained warriors, but the emotional investment of men defending their homeland. The difference in morale and effectiveness between these native soldiers and the international mercenaries employed by other European powers was immediately apparent to those who faced them in battle. The king's attention to military detail extended far beyond the recruitment and maintenance of soldiers. He personally inspected the foundries that cast cannon for the royal artillery, questioning the master craftsmen about the quality of their bronze and the precision of their boring techniques. He studied the latest developments in musket design, corresponding with gunsmiths across Europe to ensure that Swedish infantry would be armed with weapons equal to any in the world. His interest in military engineering led to the establishment of fortification schools where Swedish officers could learn the latest techniques for both attacking and defending fortified positions. The Swedish Navy, long a poor relation of the kingdom's military forces, received particular attention from Charles XI. He understood that control of the Baltic Sea was essential to Swedish security and expansion, and he was determined that his fleet would be capable of challenging any power that threatened Swedish interests. New shipyards were established along the Swedish coast, their ways busy with the construction of vessels that combined the traditional strength of Scandinavian shipbuilding with the latest innovations in naval architecture. The king's flagship, the Kronan, became a symbol of Swedish naval ambition, with its 126 guns and crew of nearly 900 men. It was one of the largest warships in the world, capable of engaging any vessel that might threaten Swedish dominance of the Baltic. But Charles XI's vision extended beyond individual ships, however magnificent, to the creation of a naval infrastructure that could support sustained operations across the Baltic and beyond. Naval bases were established at strategic points along the Swedish coast, their harbors deepened and fortified to provide secure anchorage for the royal fleet. Supplies of naval stores, the tar, timber, rope, and canvas essential for maintaining wooden warships were secured through careful management of Sweden's vast forests. The king understood that naval power was not simply a matter of building ships but of maintaining them in fighting condition across the months and years of active service. The creation of this military machine required not only wealth but expertise, and Charles XI was not too proud to learn from Sweden's enemies. French military engineers were quietly recruited to strengthen Swedish fortifications. Dutch naval architects were consulted on the design of new warships. German artillery experts were invited to improve the effectiveness of Swedish cannon. The king's pragmatism in seeking the best military advice available, regardless of its source, demonstrated his understanding that national pride was a luxury that Sweden could not afford in its quest for security. But the most important military innovation of Charles XI's reign was not technical but organizational. He created a professional officer corps that owed its advancement to merit rather than birth or wealth. Young men from modest backgrounds who demonstrated military aptitude could rise through the ranks to positions of real authority, while nobles who expected command positions as their birthright found themselves relegated to ceremonial roles if they lacked the competence to lead soldiers effectively. This meritocratic approach to military leadership produced a generation of officers who were intensely loyal to the crown that had elevated them and deeply committed to the military excellence that justified their positions. They studied their craft with the dedication of scholars, analyzing past battles and experimenting with new tactics. Their professionalism became a model for military organizations across Europe, and their effectiveness in battle would soon demonstrate the wisdom of Charles XI's reforms. The king's personal involvement in military affairs extended to the most minute details of soldier life. He specified the quality of cloth that should be used for uniforms, the nutritional content of military rations, and the construction standards for military barracks. This attention to detail was not the fussiness of a micromanager, but the careful calculation of a ruler who understood that military effectiveness depended upon the welfare of individual soldiers as much as upon grand strategic concepts. Swedish soldiers, well-fed, well-equipped, and well-led, became the envy of Europe. Their discipline in battle was matched by their restraint in victory, reflecting the professional standards that Charles XI had instilled throughout his military organization. When these soldiers marched through foreign territories, they carried with them not only the power of Swedish arms, but the reputation of Swedish civilization. The transformation of Sweden's military was completed with the establishment of military academies where young officers could receive formal training in the arts of war. These institutions, modeled after the great military schools of France and Prussia, produced graduates who combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience. They studied mathematics and engineering alongside swordsmanship and horsemanship, emerging as complete military professionals, capable of adapting to the changing nature of warfare. The administrative revolution that accompanied Charles XI's military reforms was perhaps even more radical in its implications for Swedish society. The king was not content merely to reclaim the wealth that had been dispersed during the Regency years. He was determined to create a system of government that would ensure such dispersal could never happen again. The bureaucracy that emerged from these reforms was unlike anything that had existed in Swedish history. A professional administration that served the crown rather than the personal interests of its members. The old system of government, based upon the competing interests of noble factions and the traditional rights of ancient families, was swept away with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized the Great Reduction. In its place, Charles XI created a hierarchy of royal officials whose authority derived entirely from their commissions, and whose loyalty was maintained through regular salary payments from the royal treasury. These men, drawn from the emerging middle class as well as from the reduced nobility, owed their positions to their competence rather than their birth. The transformation was visible in the very architecture of government. The old system had been centered in the great noble houses, where magnates had held court like independent princes. The new system was concentrated in government buildings. In Stockholm, where royal officials worked in offices that reflected their function rather than their social status. The symbolic message was clear. Power now flowed from the crown to its servants, not from ancient families to their dependents. Charles XI's personal involvement in administrative details was as obsessive as his attention to military affairs. He insisted on reviewing major appointments personally, questioning candidates about their qualifications and their understanding of royal policy. He established regular reporting requirements that ensured he remained informed about the implementation of his orders throughout the kingdom. His famous work ethic, which saw him at his desk before dawn and often working by candlelight long after his courtiers had retired, became the standard expected of all royal officials. The king's reforms extended to the very foundations of Swedish law and justice. He commissioned the creation of a new legal code that would replace the patchwork of local customs and noble privileges that had previously governed Swedish society. This code, based upon the principle that all subjects were equal before the law, regardless of their social status, represented a revolutionary departure from the medieval understanding of justice as a privilege that varied according to rank and wealth. The implementation of uniform legal standards throughout Sweden required the creation of a professional judiciary, whose members were trained in the new legal principles and whose loyalty was to the law rather than to local magnates. These judges, many of them drawn from the universities that were beginning to flourish under royal patronage, brought to their positions a scholarly approach to legal questions that gradually replaced the arbitrary decisions of local strongmen. The economic implications of these administrative reforms were as significant as their political effects. The creation of a professional civil service provided employment for educated men who might otherwise have been forced to seek their fortunes abroad. The standardization of legal procedures reduced the uncertainty that had previously plagued commercial transactions. The elimination of local privileges and exemptions created a more unified market that encouraged trade and manufacturing. Charles XI's attention to detail extended to the physical infrastructure that supported his administrative revolution. New roads were constructed to improve communication between Stockholm and the provinces, their routes carefully planned to serve the needs of government as well as commerce. A postal system was established that enabled royal officials to correspond regularly with their superiors in the capital. The efficiency of these communications networks became a source of Swedish competitive advantage, enabling the kingdom to respond rapidly to changing circumstances. The transformation of Swedish government was not accomplished without resistance. Many nobles who had lost their traditional privileges through the Great Reduction found themselves further marginalized by the creation of a professional bureaucracy that had no need for their hereditary services. Their complaints, however, fell upon deaf ears. Charles XI had no patience for those who preferred the inefficiencies of the old system to the demanding excellence of the new. The king's reforms created a government that was capable of mobilizing Sweden's resources with unprecedented efficiency. When royal officials issued orders, they were obeyed throughout the kingdom with a promptness that amazed foreign observers. When taxes were assessed, they were collected with a completeness that filled the royal treasury. When military service was required, men appeared at the appointed places with an organization that reflected the systematic nature of the entire administrative structure. This efficiency came at a cost. The warmth and personal relationships that had characterized the old system of government were replaced by the cold professionalism of bureaucratic administration. Local traditions that had flourished under the protection of noble patrons were swept away by the standardizing impulse of royal reform. The colorful diversity of medieval Sweden was gradually replaced by the uniformity that absolute monarchy required. But Charles XI was not building a kingdom for the nostalgic pleasure of antiquarians. He was creating a state that could survive and prosper in the competitive environment of modern Europe. The Sweden that emerged from his reforms was stronger, more unified, and more efficient than the loose confederation of noble interests that had previously borne the Swedish name. It was a kingdom capable of great achievements, but also one that would require great leadership to realize its potential. The mature Charles XI, who emerged from the transformative years of the Great Reduction, was a monarch unlike any who had previously sat upon the Swedish throne. Gone was the uncertain youth who had inherited a kingdom divided by faction and weakened by the dispersal of royal authority. In his place stood a ruler whose personal habits and daily routine reflected the systematic efficiency he had imposed upon his kingdom. The king who rose before dawn to review reports from provincial governors and retired late after examining the details of military requisitions had become the living embodiment of the absolute monarchy he had created. His court at Stockholm reflected this transformation, where previous Swedish monarchs had presided over gatherings that resembled elaborate social occasions. Charles XI's court was a working institution focused upon the business of government. Nobles who had once expected to be entertained at royal expense found themselves assigned specific administrative duties. Foreign ambassadors who had anticipated the ceremonial pageantry common to European courts discovered that audiences with the Swedish king were brief. Businesslike affairs focused upon matters of state rather than social pleasantries. The king's personal relationships suffered under the weight of his devotion to duty. His marriage to Ulrika, Eleonora of Denmark, arranged to cement the peace between the two Scandinavian kingdoms, was more a diplomatic alliance than a romantic partnership. The queen, intelligent and capable in her own right, found herself relegated to the traditional feminine sphere of court life, while her husband immersed himself in the masculine world of military and administrative affairs. Their children, when they came, were raised more as future servants of the state than as typical royal offspring. Yet this apparent coldness masked a genuine passion for the welfare of his subjects. Charles XI's correspondence with provincial officials reveals a monarch deeply concerned with the practical details of governing the condition of roads, the fairness of tax collection, the adequacy of military supplies. He took personal interest in legal cases that came before royal courts, often reversing decisions that he believed failed to serve the cause of justice. His dedication to duty was not mere obsession, but a reflection of his understanding that the welfare of Sweden depended upon the quality of its governance. The king's daily routine became legendary among his subjects. He began each day by reviewing overnight dispatches from military commanders and provincial governors. His breakfast consumed while reading reports that kept him informed of conditions throughout his kingdom. Morning audiences with officials were followed by afternoon sessions devoted to military planning, and evening hours spent in personal correspondence with foreign rulers and Swedish officials abroad. This schedule, maintained with clockwork regularity, demonstrated the king's belief that effective governance required constant attention. Charles XI's personal austerity contrasted sharply with the magnificent court life maintained by his European contemporaries. While Louis XIV built the glittering palace of Versailles and surrounded himself with elaborate ceremony, the Swedish king lived with a simplicity that bordered on the monastic. His personal apartments were furnished with functional comfort rather than ostentatious display. His meals were plain fare, designed to sustain rather than impress. His clothing, while appropriate to his rank, avoided the excessive ornamentation that characterized royal fashion elsewhere in Europe. This austere lifestyle was not merely personal preference, but calculated policy. Charles XI understood that the resources saved by royal economy could be devoted to strengthening the military and improving the administration. Every gold coin not spent on court ceremonial was available for casting cannon or paying soldiers. Every hour not devoted to social obligations could be spent on the serious business of governing. The king's personal example established a standard of dedicated service that influenced his officials throughout the kingdom. The transformation of Swedish society under Charles XI's personal rule extended beyond the formal structures of government to the very character of the Swedish people. The king's emphasis on merit over birth created opportunities for advancement that had previously been reserved for the nobility. Farmers' sons who demonstrated ability could rise through the ranks of the military or civil service to positions of real authority. Merchants who showed entrepreneurial skill found themselves welcomed at court as advisors on economic policy. The rigid social hierarchy that had previously defined Swedish society became more flexible under the influence of royal pragmatism. But this social mobility came with obligations. Those who rose through royal favor were expected to dedicate themselves to the service of the crown with the same intensity that characterized the king's own devotion to duty. The professional standards that Charles XI imposed upon his administration became the measure by which all royal servants were judged. Excellence was rewarded with promotion and increased responsibility. Mediocrity was punished with dismissal and disgrace. The king's personal involvement in the education of his subjects reflected his understanding that an effective, absolute monarchy required competent servants at all levels of society. He encouraged the establishment of schools that would provide basic literacy and numeracy to the children of farmers and craftsmen. He supported the expansion of universities that could train the lawyers, administrators, and military officers that his government required. His investment in education was as strategic as his investment in military hardware, aimed at creating a population capable of supporting the ambitious goals he had set for Sweden. Religious affairs received the same systematic attention that Charles XI devoted to secular matters. The Lutheran Church, which had been the official religion of Sweden since the Reformation, was reformed to serve the needs of the absolute monarchy. Pastors were expected to preach obedience to royal authority as well as submission to divine will. Church records were standardized to serve the administrative needs of the state. The moral authority of religion was harnessed to support the political authority of the crown. The king's personal piety was genuine but practical. He attended religious services regularly and maintained a personal chaplain who provided spiritual guidance. But his faith was expressed through his dedication to the welfare of his subjects, rather than through elaborate religious ceremonies. He saw himself as God's appointed agent for the governance of Sweden, responsible for the temporal welfare of souls that would ultimately be judged by their Creator. Foreign observers struggled to understand the nature of Charles XI's monarchy. It was absolute in its concentration of power, but benevolent in its exercise. It was efficient in its administration, but responsive to the needs of ordinary subjects. It was austere in its personal style, but generous in its public investments. The Swedish king had created something that seemed to combine the best features of various forms of government while avoiding their characteristic weaknesses. As the 17th century drew toward its close, the fruits of Charles XI's patient labor began to manifest in ways that would have seemed impossible during the troubled years of his youth. The Sweden that had emerged from decades of systematic reform was no longer the loose confederation of noble interests that had characterized the kingdom in its medieval period. Instead, it had become a unified state capable of projecting power across the Baltic and beyond, its resources concentrated in royal hands and its administration responsive to royal will. The young men who came of age during these years of transformation were different from their fathers in fundamental ways. Where the previous generation had been raised in the factional politics of competing noble houses, these youth grew up in a kingdom where merit determined. Advancement and royal service provided the path to honor and prosperity. They studied in schools that emphasized practical skills over aristocratic accomplishments, learning mathematics and engineering alongside the traditional pursuits of gentlemen. Their heroes were not the great magnates of the past, but the professional soldiers and administrators who had risen through royal favor. Prince Charles, the king's eldest son, embodied this new generation in ways that both pleased and occasionally worried his father. The prince was intellectually gifted, mastering languages and military arts, with an ease that suggested he had inherited the best qualities of his royal ancestry. But he also displayed a restless energy and appetite for glory that reminded Charles XI of the ambitious young nobles who had once threatened the stability of the kingdom. The careful balance between confidence and caution that had characterized the father's reign would be tested by the son's more aggressive temperament. The prince's education reflected the systematic approach that Charles XI applied to all aspects of governance. Military instruction was provided by the most skilled officers in the Swedish army, men who had proven themselves in actual combat rather than in the theoretical exercises of peacetime. Academic studies were supervised by scholars who combined deep learning with practical experience in government service. The prince was expected to master not only the traditional accomplishments of royalty but also the detailed knowledge of administration that effective absolute monarchy required. Young Charles's early exposure to the business of government came through regular attendance at his father's audiences with foreign ambassadors and Swedish officials. The prince observed the patient negotiation, careful calculation, and attention to detail that characterized his father's approach to ruling. But he also witnessed the deference with which Sweden's neighbors treated the kingdom that had once been regarded as a peripheral power. The respect that Swedish arms had earned through careful preparation and professional excellence was intoxicating to a young man eager to prove himself worthy of his inheritance. The transformation of Swedish society was visible in the officers who served alongside the prince during his military training. These men many of them drawn from modest backgrounds, displayed a professional competence that would have been impossible under the old system of noble privilege. They understood warfare not as a romantic adventure, but as a technical craft requiring careful study and constant practice. Their influence upon the prince was profound, shaping his understanding of military leadership and his expectations for the army he would someday command. The foreign policy challenges that emerged during the later years of Charles XI's reign provided opportunities for the prince to observe diplomacy at the highest levels. The complex negotiations surrounding the War of the League of Augsburg demonstrated the importance of careful preparation and strategic thinking. Sweden's ability to maintain its independence while other European powers exhausted themselves in prolonged conflict reflected the wisdom of the king's patient approach to international affairs. But the prince's temperament was less suited to the patient calculation that had characterized his father's success, where Charles XI had been content to strengthen Sweden gradually, building the foundations of power through careful reform and systematic improvement. The prince dreamed of the dramatic gestures that would establish his personal reputation. The young man who had been raised on stories of Gustav Adolf's victories in Germany was eager to earn similar glory for himself. The tension between father and son over the proper pace of Swedish expansion reflected a broader generational divide. Within the kingdom, the older generation, which had lived through the uncertainties of the Regency years and the gradual consolidation of royal power, appreciated the stability that Charles XI's reforms had brought. The younger generation, which had known only the security and prosperity of the reformed kingdom, was eager to test Sweden's strength against its neighbors. Charles XI's attempts to moderate his son's ambitions were motivated by his understanding of the delicate balance that maintained Swedish power. The kingdom's resources, while substantial, were not infinite. The military machine that had been so carefully constructed could be destroyed by a single disastrous campaign. The diplomatic relationships that kept Sweden's enemies divided required constant attention and occasional compromise. The king, who had built Swedish power through patient accumulation, understood how quickly it could be dissipated through rash action. The prince's circle of companions reflected the social changes that had transformed Swedish society. Unlike the factional groups that had characterized previous generations of court life, these young men were united by their shared commitment to Swedish greatness rather than by competing family interests. They studied military history together, debated strategic questions, and dreamed of the campaigns that would establish Sweden as the dominant power in Northern Europe. Their enthusiasm was infectious, but their inexperience was also dangerous. As Charles XI's health began to decline during the final years of his reign, the question of succession became increasingly pressing. The prince who would inherit the Swedish throne was intellectually capable and militarily skilled, but he lacked the patient temperament that had enabled his father to build Swedish power through careful reform. The kingdom that Charles XI had created was strong enough to survive the tests that lay ahead, but only if its resources were used wisely. The administrative system that Charles XI had established was designed to function regardless of the personal qualities of individual monarchs. Professional officials who owed their positions to merit rather than birth would continue to serve the crown efficiently. The military organization that had been built through decades of careful investment would remain effective under competent leadership. The financial resources that had been accumulated through systematic reform would be available for whatever challenges the future might bring. But the ultimate test of Charles XI's reforms would come not during his own lifetime, but under the rule of his successor. The prince, who had been raised in the knowledge that Sweden was a great power, would face the challenge of proving that this greatness was real rather than merely theoretical. The kingdom that had been built through patient accumulation would be tested by the more aggressive policies that the new generation seemed eager to pursue. The transformation of Sweden from a medieval kingdom into a modern state was essentially complete by the time Charles XI approached the end of his reign. The scattered domains that had once acknowledged Swedish overlordship had been welded into a unified kingdom capable of acting with single purpose. The resources that had been dispersed among competing noble factions had been concentrated in royal hands and directed toward the strengthening of Swedish power. The administrative and military systems that had been created through decades of systematic reform provided the foundations for whatever achievements the future might bring. As the year 1697 dawned, Charles XI could look back upon a reign that had transformed Sweden more thoroughly than any previous monarch had managed. The kingdom that he would leave to his son was stronger, more unified, and more prosperous than the Sweden he had inherited. But the great test lay ahead, in the hands of a prince whose temperament was very different from his father's, and whose understanding of power had been shaped by the success, rather than the struggles of Swedish arms. The stage was set for the final act of Sweden's imperial drama, though few could have anticipated the magnitude of the conflicts that lay ahead. The patient work of consolidation and reform that had characterized Charles XI's reign would soon give way to the more dramatic policies of his successor. The kingdom that had been built through careful accumulation would be tested by the ambitions of a young king eager to prove himself worthy of his inheritance. In the quiet chambers of Stockholm Castle, where Charles XI had spent so many hours in the patient work of governance, the maps and dispatches that covered his working tables told the story of a kingdom transformed. Sweden's frontiers stretched across the Baltic, encompassing territories that had been won through military skill and diplomatic cunning. The administrative reports that arrived daily from provincial governors documented the efficient functioning of a government that had been reformed to serve the needs of absolute monarchy. The military assessments that detailed the strength of Swedish forces revealed an army and navy capable of challenging any European power. All of this, the territorial expansion, the administrative efficiency, the military strength, was the legacy that Charles XI would leave to his son. But the most important legacy was perhaps the most intangible: the transformation of Swedish society from a loose confederation of competing interests into a unified kingdom capable of great achievements. The Sweden that emerged from Charles XI's reign was no longer a peripheral power dependent upon the favor of its neighbors. It had become a great power in its own right, with the resources and organization necessary to play a leading role in European affairs. The question that remained was whether this carefully constructed power would be used wisely. The prince, who would inherit the Swedish throne, possessed the intellectual gifts and military skills necessary for great leadership, but he also possessed the restless ambition that had destroyed many promising rulers. The kingdom that Charles XI had built was strong enough to survive the tests that lay ahead, but only if its resources were used with the same careful calculation that had characterized their accumulation that as winter gave way to spring. In 1697, the Swedish kingdom stood poised on the threshold of its greatest trial. The reforms that had been implemented over decades of patient work had created the foundations for unprecedented achievement. The military forces that had been trained and equipped through systematic investment were ready for any challenge. The administrative system that had been established through careful planning was capable of supporting whatever policies the new reign might bring. But the ultimate test would come not from the strength of Swedish institutions, but from the wisdom of Swedish leadership. The young prince who would soon inherit the crown had been raised in the knowledge that Sweden was a great power, but he had yet to learn the delicate balance required to maintain that greatness. The kingdom that his father had built through patient accumulation would soon be tested by the more aggressive policies that the new generation seemed eager to pursue. In the end, the legacy of Charles XI's reign would be judged not by what he had accomplished, but by what his successor would achieve with the tools he had provided. The Sweden that emerged from the reforms of the late 17th century was capable of great things, but capability alone was not enough. The test would come in the application of that capability to the challenges that lay ahead, and in that test, the true measure of Charles XI's achievement would be revealed. The winter of 1708 descended upon the Swedish army like a living thing, breathing ice into their lungs and freezing the very marrow in their bones. Charles XII, the Lion of the North, led his dwindling forces deeper into the heart of Russia, pursuing an enemy that seemed to dissolve like mist before his advance. The great gamble had begun in earnest now, and the winds of fortune, so long at Sweden's back, began to shift with an almost audible whisper of change. For 20 years, Swedish steel had carved its name across the battlefields of Europe. The empire that had begun as a collection of scattered territories around the Baltic had grown into a colossus that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the shores of the Baltic Sea, from the forests of Finland to the trading posts of Germany. Yet now, in the depths of a Russian winter that seemed to have no end, the very foundations of that empire began to tremble. Charles himself remained unchanged, his blue eyes as hard as winter steel, his resolve as unyielding as the Swedish granite. At 36 years of age, he had never known defeat, never bent the knee to any foreign power, never acknowledged the possibility that Swedish arms might fail. His soldiers followed him not merely out of duty, but out of something deeper belief that their king possessed a divine mandate that made him untouchable by mortal concerns. The campaign that had begun with such promise in 1707 had slowly transformed into something else entirely. What had started as a bold strike toward Moscow had become a grinding march through endless forests and frozen plains. The Russian army, under the cunning leadership of Peter the Great, employed tactics that frustrated every Swedish attempt to force a decisive battle. They retreated, they burned the countryside, they harassed the Swedish flanks with light cavalry, but they would not stand and fight in the manner that Swedish military doctrine demanded. As the months passed, the Swedish army began to bleed strength, not through any single catastrophic defeat, but through the constant attrition of disease, desertion, and the simple exhaustion of men pushed beyond their limits. The supply lines that stretched back to Sweden grew ever more tenuous, and the promised reinforcements from the Ottoman Empire proved to be as insubstantial as summer clouds. In the spring of 1709, Charles made a decision that would echo through the centuries. Rather than retreat to safety, rather than consolidate his position and await reinforcements, he chose to besiege the fortress city of Poltava. It was a choice that embodied everything about the Swedish captain: bold, decisive, and utterly committed to victory or death. The siege of Poltava stretched through the warming months of 1709 as Swedish engineers worked to breach the city's walls, while Russian forces gathered in the surrounding countryside. Charles himself was wounded in the leg during a reconnaissance mission, a seemingly minor injury that would prove to have far-reaching consequences. Unable to mount his horse, unable to move freely among his troops, the king who had always led from the front found himself constrained by his own mortal limitations. On the morning of June 28, 1709, the two armies finally met in the open field outside Poltava. The Swedish forces, numbering perhaps 20,000 men, faced a Russian army nearly twice their size. Yet Swedish confidence remained unshaken. Had they not defeated greater odds before? Had not Swedish steel proven its superiority time and again against the massed ranks of their enemies? The battle began before dawn, with Swedish infantry advancing in their traditional formation, their blue and yellow banners snapping in the morning breeze. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the old magic would work again. The Swedish attack broke through the Russian first line, and the familiar cry of God, Konung, Fosterland, God, King, Fatherland rang across the battlefield. But then, in the space of a few terrible hours, the tide turned. The Russian artillery, positioned with deadly precision, began to tear gaps in the Swedish ranks. The promised breakthrough never came. Instead, the Swedish forces found themselves isolated, surrounded, and slowly ground down by the sheer weight of Russian numbers. By midday, the army that had marched triumphantly across Europe for 2 decades was in full retreat. Charles himself, carried in a litter due to his wound, watched as his life's work crumbled before his eyes. The Swedish army, that perfect instrument of war that had seemed invincible, dissolved into scattered groups of desperate men fleeing for their lives. Some made it back to Swedish territory. Many did not. The king himself, along with a few hundred faithful followers, crossed the border into Ottoman territory, where they would remain in exile for the next 5 years. The city of Bender in Ottoman Moldavia became an unlikely prison for the Lion of the North. Here, in a modest house provided by the Sultan's generosity, Charles XII established a court in exile that bore little resemblance to the magnificent palaces of Stockholm. The man who had once commanded the respect of every European monarch now found himself dependent on the charity of a foreign power. His empire reduced to a handful of loyal servants and a dwindling treasury. Yet even in exile, Charles remained unchanged. He rose each morning at the same hour, maintained the same rigid schedule, and continued to plan for the restoration of Swedish power, as if the disaster at Poltava had been merely a temporary setback. His correspondence with Stockholm continued, filled with detailed instructions for the governance of his domains and elaborate plans for future campaigns. To those who served him, he remained every inch the king, his authority as absolute as ever. The years in Bender passed like a strange dream. The Ottoman Empire, locked in its own struggles with Russia, found the Swedish king to be both a useful ally and a dangerous guest. Charles pressed constantly for Ottoman support for a new campaign against Russia, promising victories that would restore the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The Sultan, pragmatic and cautious, provided enough support to keep Charles hopeful, but not enough to risk a renewed conflict with Peter the Great. Meanwhile, the Swedish Empire itself began to show the strains of prolonged war and absent leadership. The Regency Council in Stockholm, led by Charles's sister Ulrika Eleonora, struggled to maintain order as enemies pressed in from all sides. Denmark reclaimed its lost territories in the south. Russia advanced through the Baltic provinces. Poland, freed from Swedish domination, began to reassert its independence. The great empire that had taken a century to build was being dismantled piece by piece in the Finnish provinces, where Swedish rule had been established for centuries. The people began to experience the harsh realities of foreign occupation. Russian forces, advancing through the forests and lakes of Finland, brought with them not merely military conquest, but cultural transformation. The ancient ties that bound Finland to Sweden, forged through centuries of shared history and common struggle, began to fray under the pressure of war and occupation. The Baltic provinces Livonia, Estonia, and Courland fell to Russian forces. One by one, these territories, which had been the jewels of the Swedish Empire, providing both strategic position and considerable wealth, were lost with a finality that seemed to mock the grand ambitions of earlier generations. The German nobility, who had served Swedish kings for generations, now found themselves subjects of the Russian Tsar, their ancient privileges and traditions swept away by the tide of war. In 1714, Charles finally returned to Sweden, arriving unexpectedly. At the fortress of Stralsund in Swedish Pomerania, the king who had left his country as the undisputed master of Northern Europe returned to find his empire in ruins, his treasury empty, and his people exhausted by decades of war. Yet Charles himself seemed unchanged by his ordeal. If anything, his determination to restore Swedish greatness had hardened during his years in exile. The Sweden that Charles found upon his return was a shadow of the great power he had inherited. The population had been decimated by war, disease, and famine. The great estates that had once provided the backbone of Swedish society lay in ruins. The administrative system that had made Sweden a model of efficient governance had been stretched to the breaking point. Most devastating of all, the spirit of invincibility that had sustained Swedish arms for generations had been broken on the fields of Poltava, despite the desperate state of his kingdom. Charles XII refused to accept the reality of Sweden's decline. The years in exile had not diminished his appetite for war, nor had they taught him the wisdom of compromise. If anything, the king who returned to Sweden in 1714 was more determined than ever to restore his empire to its former glory, regardless of the cost to his people or his treasury. The final years of Charles's reign were marked by a series of increasingly desperate campaigns, each one designed to reclaim what had been lost at Poltava. The Swedish army, rebuilt from the remnants of the old forces and filled out with young conscripts who had never known the glory days of Swedish arms, fought with the courage of their forebears but lacked the resources and experience that had once made them invincible. In 1715, Charles led his forces into Norway, seeking to compensate for the loss of the Baltic provinces by conquering Sweden's western neighbor. The campaign began with some success, as Swedish forces advanced deep into Norwegian territory, but the pattern that had emerged at Poltava repeated itself. The enemy refused to offer battle on Swedish terms, instead conducting a defensive campaign that slowly wore down the invading forces. The Norwegian campaign dragged on for years, consuming resources that Sweden could ill afford and achieving little in return. The Swedish forces, fighting in the harsh terrain of the Norwegian mountains, found themselves engaged in a type of warfare for which their training had not prepared them. The grand battles and decisive victories that had characterized Swedish military history gave way to a grinding war of attrition that favored the defender. As the campaigns continued, the burden on the Swedish people grew ever heavier. Taxes reached crushing levels as the government struggled to fund the war effort. Young men were pressed into service in ever greater numbers, leaving farms and workshops empty. The trade that had once made Sweden prosperous was disrupted by the constant warfare, and the kingdom's economy began to collapse under the strain. Charles himself seemed oblivious to the suffering of his people. The king who had once been celebrated as the defender of Swedish liberty now ruled with an iron hand, brooking no opposition to his military ambitions. Those who dared to suggest that perhaps the time had come to make peace were dismissed or, in some cases, prosecuted for treason. The absolutist state that had been created to serve Swedish greatness had become an end in itself. In the autumn of 1718, Charles was preparing for yet another campaign into Norway, when fate finally intervened. On November 30th, while inspecting the trenches outside the fortress of Fredrikstad, the king was struck by a bullet and killed instantly. The circumstances of his death remained mysterious. Whether he fell to enemy fire or to an assassin's bullet was never conclusively determined. What was certain was that the death of Charles XII marked the end of an era in Swedish history. The news of the king's death spread across Europe like wildfire. In the chancelleries of the great powers, diplomats and statesmen who had spent decades calculating the threat posed by Swedish arms suddenly found themselves confronting a new reality. The empire that had dominated northern Europe for a century was suddenly leaderless, its future uncertain, its power broken. In Sweden itself, the reaction was more complex. There was grief, certainly, for a king who had embodied the nation's military glory, but there was also relief that the long nightmare of constant warfare might finally be coming to an end. The people of Sweden, exhausted by decades of sacrifice, looked forward to a peace that would allow them to rebuild their shattered lives. The death of Charles XII created a succession crisis that would determine the fate of the Swedish Empire. The king had never married, had produced no heir, and had left no clear instructions for the succession. The throne passed to his sister, Ulrika Eleonora, but her claim was disputed, and the great council of nobles that had governed Sweden during the king's absence seized the opportunity to limit royal power. The Age of Liberty, as it came to be known, marked the end of Swedish absolutism and the beginning of a new era in which power was shared between the crown and the parliament. The new constitution, adopted in 1720, effectively neutered the monarchy and established Sweden as a constitutional state. The days when a single man could commit the nation to war or peace, could command the resources of the kingdom for his personal ambitions, were over. The immediate priority for the new government was to extract Sweden from the web of conflicts that Charles XII had left behind. The Great Northern War, which had raged for nearly 20 years, had to be brought to a conclusion. The process of peacemaking would take several years and would require Sweden to acknowledge painful realities about its place in the world. The Treaty of Nystad, signed with Russia in 1721, marked the formal end of Sweden's dominance in the Baltic. The provinces of Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and parts of Karelia were ceded to Russia, along with the great fortress of Viborg. Finland, though it remained under Swedish control, was now vulnerable to Russian attack. The Baltic Sea, which had been a Swedish lake for generations, was now dominated by the Russian fleet. The human cost of the Great Northern War was staggering. Sweden's population, which had been approximately 2.5 million at the beginning of the conflict, had been reduced to fewer than 2 million by its end. Entire regions had been depopulated by war, disease, and famine. The great estates that had once provided the backbone of Swedish society lay in ruins. The administrative system that had been the pride of Swedish government had been stretched to the breaking point. Perhaps most devastating of all was the loss of Sweden's international prestige. The kingdom that had once been counted among the great powers of Europe was now relegated to the second rank. Foreign ambassadors who had once sought Swedish favor now looked to St. Petersburg and Copenhagen for leadership in northern European affairs. The empire that had taken a century to build had been dismantled in the span of a single generation. The Baltic provinces, which had been the crown jewels of the Swedish Empire, were now firmly under Russian control. The German nobility, who had served Swedish kings for generations, were forced to adapt to new masters, their ancient privileges and traditions swept away by the tide of history. The towns and cities that had once been proud outposts of Swedish civilization now looked eastward to St. Petersburg for their future. In Finland, the effects of the war were equally profound. The eastern provinces, which had been devastated by Russian raids, were slowly rebuilt under new management. The Finnish people, who had fought loyally for Swedish kings for centuries, now found themselves caught between two empires, their loyalty divided between old traditions and new realities. The cultural ties that had bound Finland to Sweden remained strong, but the political reality was that Swedish protection could no longer be guaranteed. The aftermath of the Great Northern War saw the emergence of Russia as the dominant power. In Northern Europe, Peter the Great, who had once been dismissed as a barbarian by Swedish courtiers, had succeeded in transforming his backward kingdom into a modern European state. The city of St. Petersburg, built on the marshes of the Neva River, became a symbol of Russian ambition and a constant reminder of Swedish decline. The Sweden that emerged from the Great Northern War was a fundamentally different country from the one that had entered it. The age of military glory was over, and the nation was forced to reinvent itself in a world where Swedish arms no longer commanded respect. The process of transformation was gradual and often painful, but it ultimately led to the creation of a new kind of Swedish identity. The immediate aftermath of the war saw Sweden struggling with the basic tasks of reconstruction. The countryside, devastated by years of warfare, had to be resettled and replanted. The administrative system, which had been focused on supporting military campaigns, had to be rebuilt for peacetime governance. The economy, which had been distorted by the demands of war, had to be rebalanced to support a population that could no longer live off the spoils of conquest. The Age of Liberty, which lasted from 1720 to 1772, represented Sweden's first experiment with constitutional government. The parliament, which had been largely ceremonial during the era of absolutism, now became the center of political life. The great noble families who had once competed for the favor of the king now competed for control of the parliament. The result was a system of government that was more democratic than anything that had existed in Sweden before, but which was also more fractious and less capable of decisive action. The new system had its problems. The parliament was divided into factions that often put party advantage ahead of national interest. Foreign powers, particularly France and Russia, interfered in Swedish politics through bribes and diplomatic pressure. The economy struggled to recover from the devastation of war, and Sweden found itself increasingly dependent on foreign loans and subsidies. Yet there were also positive developments. The end of constant warfare allowed Swedish society to turn its attention to other pursuits. The sciences and arts, which had been neglected during the military campaigns, began to flourish. Swedish scholars and inventors made important contributions to fields ranging from botany to metallurgy. The Swedish economy, no longer focused on supporting massive military campaigns, began to diversify and modernize. The transformation of Sweden was not merely political and economic, but also cultural. The military ethos that had dominated Swedish society for generations began to give way to new values. The ideal of the warrior king, embodied by Charles XII, was replaced by the ideal of the enlightened ruler, who governed through reason and law rather than force of arms. The Swedish people, who had once taken pride in their military prowess, began to take pride in their contributions to human knowledge and civilization. The memory of the empire remained, however, as both an inspiration and a burden. Swedish historians and poets celebrated the achievements of the great kings and generals who had made Sweden a European power. The victories at Breitenfeld and Lutzen, the conquest of the Baltic provinces, the dominance of the Baltic Sea, all of these became part of a national mythology that sustained Swedish pride even in defeat at the same time. The memory of the empire's collapse served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. The fate of Charles XII, who had led his kingdom to ruin in pursuit of military glory, became a warning about the perils of absolute power. The Swedish people, who had paid such a heavy price for their king's ambitions, were determined never again to allow a single man to commit the nation to such a destructive course. The legacy of the Swedish Empire was thus complex and contradictory. It was a source of national pride and a reminder of national folly, a testament to Swedish greatness and a warning about Swedish hubris. The empire had transformed Sweden from a minor Scandinavian kingdom into a major European power. But its collapse had also demonstrated the fragility of power and the dangers of overreach. As the decades passed after the Great Northern War, Sweden slowly adapted to its new role as a medium-sized European state. The grand ambitions of the imperial age gave way to more modest goals: internal development, economic growth, and cultural achievement. Yet the shadow of the empire continued to influence Swedish politics and culture long after the last Swedish garrison had been withdrawn from the Baltic provinces. The question of Finland remained a constant source of tension between Sweden and Russia. The Finnish provinces, which had been part of the Swedish realm for centuries, were now vulnerable to Russian attack. The cultural and political ties that bound Finland to Sweden remained strong, but the military reality was that Sweden could no longer guaranteed Finnish security. This vulnerability would eventually lead to the loss of Finland in 1809, completing the dismantling of the Swedish Empire. The Swedish military, which had once been the terror of Europe, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The great regiments that had marched across Germany and Poland were disbanded or drastically reduced in size. The military innovations that had made Swedish arms so effective, the disciplined infantry, the mobile artillery, the combined arms tactics, were adopted by other European armies, while Sweden itself could no longer afford to maintain a world-class military force. The administrative system that had been created to support the empire was also transformed. The efficient bureaucracy that had managed the affairs of a great power was scaled back to match Sweden's reduced circumstances. The central government, which had once coordinated the affairs of territories scattered across northern Europe, now focused on the more mundane tasks of domestic administration. Yet the experience of empire had left its mark on Swedish culture and institutions. The legal system, which had been reformed to accommodate the diverse populations of the empire, retained its emphasis on uniform justice and efficient administration. The educational system, which had been expanded to train administrators and officers for imperial service, continued to emphasize practical learning and technical competence. The Swedish language, which had been spread throughout the Baltic region by imperial expansion, remained the language of culture and commerce in many areas long after Swedish political control had ended. The intellectual legacy of the empire was perhaps even more important. The experience of governing diverse populations had taught Swedes the importance of tolerance and pragmatism. The need to integrate different legal systems, religious traditions, and cultural practices had forced Swedish administrators to develop flexible and adaptive approaches to governance. These lessons would serve Sweden well in the centuries to come. As the country developed into a modern welfare state, the economic legacy of the empire was more mixed. The wealth that had flowed into Sweden from the Baltic provinces had been largely consumed by the military campaigns of the Great Northern War. The trading networks that had been established during the imperial period had been disrupted by the war and never fully recovered. Yet the experience of managing a diverse economy had taught Swedish merchants and administrators valuable lessons about international trade and economic development. The cultural impact of the empire was perhaps most visible in the realm of architecture and art. The palaces and churches built during the imperial period remained as monuments to Swedish greatness. The artistic traditions established by court painters and sculptors continued to influence Swedish culture long after the courts themselves had been disbanded. The grand style of the Baroque period, adapted to Swedish tastes and materials, became part of the national architectural heritage. The memory of the empire also played an important role in Swedish literature and historical writing. The great kings and generals of the imperial period became the subjects of epic poems and historical novels. The battles and campaigns that had made Sweden a European power were commemorated in monuments and museums. The Swedish people, who had lived through the traumatic collapse of their empire, sought to make sense of their history through art and literature. Yet alongside the celebration of imperial glory, there was also a growing recognition of the costs of empire. Swedish writers and thinkers began to question whether the pursuit of military glory had been worth the price paid in blood and treasure. The example of Charles XII, who had led his kingdom to ruin in pursuit of personal ambition, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. This complex relationship with the imperial past would continue to influence Swedish culture and politics for generations to come. The tension between pride in Sweden's historical achievements and recognition of the costs of those achievements would shape Swedish attitudes toward war, power, and international relations. The empire was gone, but its legacy lived on in the Swedish national consciousness. In the quiet moments between the thunderous chapters of history, when the smoke of battle has cleared and the voices of kings have faded into whispers, there remains something more enduring than conquest or defeat. The Swedish Empire, like all great human endeavors, was ultimately a story about the eternal human struggle between ambition and limitation, between the dream of permanence and the reality of change. The forests of Sweden, those ancient sentinels that had watched over the rise and fall of kingdoms, continued to stand long after the last Swedish soldier had returned from foreign battlefields. The pines and spruces that had provided the timber for the great warships of the Baltic fleet grew tall and straight, their rings marking the passage of seasons that cared nothing for human ambition. In their silence, they held the memory of an empire that had once commanded the respect of Europe. The Baltic Sea, that great highway of Swedish expansion, continued to carry ships across its grey waters. But now the vessels flew different flags, spoke different languages, carried different dreams. The sea that had once been a Swedish lake had returned to its ancient neutrality, indifferent to the claims of empires and the boasts of kings. Yet, beneath its waves lay the remains of Swedish greatness, the warships that had carried Swedish arms to distant shores, the merchant vessels that had brought the wealth of the Baltic to Stockholm's coffers. In the villages and towns of Sweden, life continued with the patient rhythm that had sustained the Swedish people through centuries of war and peace. Farmers tilled the same fields that had been cultivated during the empire's glory days, their plows turning up artifacts from a more martial age, corroded sword blade, a fragment of military equipment, a coin bearing the image of a long-dead king. These remnants of empire were absorbed into the soil, becoming part of the earth that sustained new generations of Swedes. The churches that had been built during the imperial period continued to call the faithful to worship, their bells ringing out over landscapes that had once trembled to the sound of marching armies. The prayers offered within their walls were the same that had been spoken by Swedish soldiers before battle, by Swedish mothers waiting for news from distant campaigns, by Swedish kings seeking divine blessing for their ambitions. In these sacred spaces, the empire lived on not as a political reality but as a spiritual memory. The universities and schools that had been established to train the administrators and officers of the empire continued to educate young Swedes long after the empire itself had vanished. The knowledge that had been gathered to serve imperial ambitions was transformed into wisdom that served human understanding. The scholars who had once calculated the logistics of military campaigns now devoted their talents to advancing human knowledge for its own sake in the libraries and archives of Sweden. The records of the empire were preserved like pressed flowers between the pages of history, the correspondence of kings and generals, the reports of administrators and diplomats. The accounts of merchants and soldiers were carefully maintained as testimony to a vanished world. These documents, yellowed with age and brittle with time, contained the dreams and fears of men who had believed they were building something eternal, the artistic treasures that had been commissioned during the empire's glory days, the paintings that celebrated Swedish victories, the sculptures that honored Swedish heroes, the tapestries that depicted Swedish triumphs, remained in palaces and museums as windows into a different world. Yet they spoke not merely of Swedish greatness, but of the universal human desire to create something beautiful and lasting, to leave a mark upon the world that would survive the passage of time. Perhaps most enduring of all was the example that the Swedish Empire provided of both human potential and human limitation, the same qualities that had enabled a small Scandinavian kingdom to dominate Northern Europe. Determination, innovation, courage, and unity had also contained the seeds of the empire's destruction. The absolute confidence that had made Swedish arms invincible had also made Swedish kings incapable of recognizing when the time had come to stop. The story of the Swedish Empire was thus both inspiring and sobering, a reminder that human achievement is always fragile and that the greatest victories can become the foundation for the greatest defeats. The empire had demonstrated that even the smallest nations could achieve greatness through discipline, innovation, and determination. But it had also shown that greatness, once achieved, was difficult to maintain and impossible to preserve forever. The legacy of the Swedish Empire extended far beyond the borders of Sweden itself. The administrative innovations developed by Swedish officials, the military tactics pioneered by Swedish generals, the diplomatic techniques employed by Swedish ambassadors all became part of the common heritage of European civilization. The empire's collapse had not erased these contributions, but had instead released them into the broader stream of human knowledge. In the end, the Swedish Empire had been more than just a political entity or a military force. It had been an expression of the human spirit, a manifestation of the eternal human desire to transcend limitations and achieve something greater than the sum of its parts. The empire had failed, as all empires must, but the spirit that it created, it lived on in the Swedish people and in the broader human community. The wind that blew across the battlefields of Poltava and Narva, that had once carried the sound of Swedish war cries and the thunder of Swedish artillery, now carried the voices of children playing in Swedish schoolyards, of farmers singing in Swedish fields, of scholars debating in Swedish universities. The empire was gone, but the people who had created it remained, carrying forward the best of what they had built, while learning from the worst of what they had endured. And so the story of the Swedish Empire became part of the larger story of human civilization, a chapter in the endless book of human striving, achievement, and loss. The empire had risen from the mists of the Baltic, had blazed across the sky of European history like a northern star, and had faded into the twilight of memory. But in its rising and falling, it had added something irreplaceable to the human experience, something that would endure long after the last stone of the last Swedish fortress had crumbled into dust. The forests still stand, their roots deep in Swedish soil, their branches reaching toward the same stars that once guided Swedish ships across the Baltic. The sea still rolls against the Swedish shore, its waves carrying the whispers of ancient ambitions and eternal dreams. And in the hearts of those who remember, the Swedish Empire lives on, not as a political reality, but as a testament to the endless human capacity for greatness, for folly, and for the kind of courage that dares to dream of touching the sky. In the silence that follows the end of all great stories, in the stillness that comes after the last echo of the last trumpet has faded away, there remains something more precious than victory or defeat. There remains the memory of what was attempted, the knowledge of what was achieved, and the wisdom of what was learned. The Swedish Empire had been all of these things, an achievement and a lesson, and in being all of these things, it had become immortal. The wind still blows across the Baltic, carrying with it the dreams of those who dared to build an empire from snow and steel, from courage and ambition, from the eternal human refusal to accept that small things must always remain small. The empire is gone, but the wind remembers. And in remembering, it keeps alive the part of the human spirit that refuses to accept limitations, that continues to reach toward the stars, that insists on believing that even the impossible can be achieved by those who have the courage to try in the end. That may be the greatest legacy of the Swedish Empire, the territories it conquered or the battles it won, but the example it provided of what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to accept the limitations that others would impose upon them. The empire had shown that size alone does not determine significance, that the smallest nations can write the largest chapters in the book of human history, and that the greatest victories are often won not by those who have the most resources, but by those who have the most determination. The Swedish Empire sleeps now beneath the northern lights, its dreams woven into the aurora that dances across the Arctic sky. But in its sleeping, it continues to inspire, to challenge, and to remind us that the human spirit, like the northern lights themselves, burns brightest in the darkest hours and shines most beautifully when it reaches toward the infinite darkness of the unknown. Thank you for joining this journey through the rise and fall of the Swedish Empire. If these stories of courage, ambition, and the eternal human struggle have moved you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share these timeless tales with others who might find meaning in the echoes of history. Until we meet again in the realm of stories, may your own dreams reach as high as the Swedish kings who dared to claim the Baltic as their own.